Chapter 1970 Extreme Shamelessness. Chapter 1970 Extreme Shamelessness. Fei Yun felt extremely smug at this moment. He felt as if he had exacted revenge for everything. Not long ago, Ling Han had used an iron spear to pierce his A*S, humiliating him before everyone. Now, he had snatched one of Ling Han's precious treasures before everyone, viciously returning the favor. This was amazing, far too amazing. Hunyo stood still and silently glared at Fei Yun. She was like an infuriated lioness, with her long black hair billowing in the air and flames sparking from her eyes. Boom! There was the sound of crashing waves as a colossal rock soared out from behind her. With a flap of its wings and a swish of its tails, a symbol of the great Tao materialized in the air. It was as if this symbol could suppress the heavens. She was truly enraged at this moment. She was going to kill this despicable person at all costs. He was far too deplorable, far too despicable, and far too shameless. However, Fei Yun didn't pay any heed to her. He was slightly weaker than Hunyo, yet his battle prowess still ranked within the top 10. Thus, he wouldn't be much weaker than her. At the very least, he could hold his own without being defeated too quickly. This is forged from devouring metal!" he exclaimed in excitement as he examined the divine demon's sword. As long as it had enough godly metal to devour, devouring metal would eventually evolve into divine metal. In fact, there were even rumors that the limit of devouring metal wasn't simply divine metal. As long as it had enough divine metal to devour, it could even continue to evolve. Of course, divine metal was extremely rare and valuable, so much so that even celestial kings would drool over them. As such, who would feed it divine metal? In any case, it was without a doubt that the divine demon's sword could evolve to become a celestial tool. "I've struck it rich! I've truly struck it rich!" Fei Yun roared with laughter. He felt extremely delighted, especially since he had snatched this celestial tool from an enemy's hands. He was beside himself with joy. What? Devouring metal? The other monarchs from the wide prosperity heaven were also ecstatic upon hearing this. This was equivalent to obtaining a celestial tool. No wonder Ling Han had killed that heaven soul monster with such ease. As it turned out, his weapon was a future celestial tool. Thus, it was naturally very powerful. However, no one knew that this wasn't because of the divine demon's sword. Of course, the divine demon's sword had indeed contributed greatly in piercing through the toad's defenses. It was because of this that the juice of the poisonous fruit could enter the toad's body. In their eyes, however, it was the mighty power of the divine demon's sword that had killed the heaven soul monster. They definitely had to fight for this weapon. Fei Yun, hand the sword over! That's right, hand it over! It belongs to our wide prosperity heaven. You can't hog it for yourself. Everyone shouted for Fei Yun to hand the sword over. However, how could he? He would rather become the public enemy than hand the sword over. You all deserve to die, Hunyo growled in a low voice. Her fury had already reached an extreme, and an indescribable aura started to erupt from her body. This was an aura that could crush all matter. Fei Yun and the others were astonished upon seeing this. At this moment, Hunyo reminded them of the freak, Even though there were so many of them, they still couldn't help but feel a cold chill running down their spines. It was as if they had no chance of victory. Ling Han had already recovered some of his energy, so he stood up and said in a calm voice, "Do you people know? Greed can lead to one's death." Heh! Everyone chuckled coldly upon hearing this. Was Ling Han joking? Following his logic, no one should fight for rare treasures. They should all stay at home and do nothing? If you insist on seeking death, then you only have yourself to blame, Ling Han said. He lifted his finger slightly. Whoosh! There was a flash of light as the divine demon's sword suddenly started to move by itself, stabbing toward Fei Yun and the others. Fei Yun was extremely startled by this. Only at this moment did he realize that this was still Ling Han's weapon. Even though it had left the latter's hands, the martial intent within it still hadn't been erased yet. Thus, it could still be manipulated by Ling Han. Fei Yun had been far too excited just then. This was his mortal enemy's treasure, and it was more so forged from devouring metal. Thus, he had been over the moon with excitement, so much so that he had forgotten the basics. For example, erasing the martial intent from the weapon and replacing it with his own. Of course, whether or not he could erase it was another matter altogether. A burst of sword light slashed over, and Fei Yun hurriedly grabbed the hilt of the sword in an attempt to parry. After blocking this strike, he would immediately erase Ling Han's martial intent and replace it with his own. He would assert his ownership over this sword. However, as the burst of sword light slashed over, numerous symbols of the great Tao started to materialize and pulsate, triggering a resonance with heaven and earth. This was an overwhelming power. Even though Fei Yun had successfully deflected the attack and stopped it from striking his weak points, he had ultimately failed from blocking the attack completely. First of all, the attack from the divine demon sword had been far too sudden, completely catching him off guard. Second of all, its power had been far too overwhelming. Thus, the attack still left a gash on his leg. Detestable! Fei Yun roared in anger. This was extreme joy begetting sorrow. He hadn't imagined that he would suffer a surprise attack from Ling Han. He humphed and said, "This sword is already in my hands, yet you still want to snatch it back? In your dreams! Even celestial kings would be enticed by such a precious treasure. Thus, how could he hand it over?" Ling Han shook his head upon hearing this. After being poisoned by the red-spotted green bamboo, even treatment at the first possible moment might not save the victim. This was not to mention that Fei Yun was still blabbering on and taunting Ling Han. Ling Han naturally wouldn't warn him. He said in a calm voice, "The heavens want to harvest your life, so no one can prevent this from happening." Absolute nonsense! Fei Yun was just about to chide Ling Han, yet he suddenly felt that something was off. An indescribable power suddenly started to wreak havoc inside him, directly surging toward his divine sense. It was brimming with formidable corrosive power. "You!" He pointed at Ling Han, and he was just about to say something else. However, he suddenly stopped speaking, and his entire body started to fall. Yet, before he could hit the ground, his body had already dissolved into liquid. Both his body and divine sense were annihilated. What? Everyone's hair stood on ends. Fei Yun had only suffered a gash to his leg, and this wasn't even a deep gash. In fact, it could only be considered as a scrape. Yet, this had actually killed him, a fifth severance monarch tier. This was too terrifying. With a wave of Ling Han's right hand, the divine demon sword immediately flew back to its owner. Because Fei Yun's death had been far too quick and eerie, not a single person dared to intercept the divine demon sword. They were afraid that they might follow in Fei Yun's miserable footsteps. They could only look on as the divine demon sword returned to Ling Han's hands. Pa! Ling Han caught the divine demon sword and placed it into the Black Tower. He then said in a calm voice, "Fine, since you people want to disband the alliance, come over and fight." He still had yet to fully recover, yet his voice was filled with confidence and a domineering aura. This fired up the prodigies from the calm peace heaven. They would do battle. What was there to be afraid of? "Come on, battle us! See how we beat you bastards to death!" The prodigies from the calm peace heaven all roared in fury. This was largely because some prodigies from the wide prosperity heaven were far too despicable. Not only had they been ungrateful toward Ling Han, but they had even fought over his weapon. This caused a flame of anger to burn in their chests. Now, Ling Han's words had comprehensively lit the fuse to their anger, causing them to unleash it with ferocity. "Forget about it. We're all members of the celestial realm, and we still have a common enemy to fight. It's best that we don't engage in internal conflict and ruin the harmony," Xu Yering said. "Ruin the harmony?" Yi Linfeng said in a baleful voice. "Celestial Maiden Xu, you also saw just then. Fei Yun died a miserable death right before our very eyes. Can we still coexist peacefully with the calm peace heaven? That's right. Prodigies from the wide prosperity heaven can't die for nothing. Moreover, that brat clearly possessed the ability to kill that monster, yet he purposefully hid his strength at the start. His actions led to the death of many prodigies from the wide prosperity heaven. His intentions are absolutely wicked. These people were truly resorting to arguments of twisted logic. Xu Yering frowned upon hearing this. She had a keen eye for the overall situation, yet there were some things that she couldn't say. Thus, she was at a loss for how to persuade them. Chapter 1971 Ji Wuming. Chapter 1971 Ji Wuming. Battle! With a low roar, Ling Han immediately charged forward. He had already recovered some of his battle prowess, and his defenses were more so invincible. Thus, he didn't need to worry about his safety even though he wasn't in his peak state. Under his lead, Yan Xianlu and the others also charged forward. They had already endured their anger for a very long time. At this moment, they were finally unleashing it all. Xu Yering sighed upon seeing this. With a flash, she arrived before Ling Han. She then reached over with a palm and blocked him, saying, "Brother Ling, please restrain yourself and consider the bigger picture." "The bigger picture?" Ling Han said with a cold chuckle. "You're telling me to consider the bigger picture now? When those people were trying to shoo me away just then, where did your bigger picture disappear to? When they were trying to snatch my weapon, where did your bigger picture disappear to? Say, does your so-called bigger picture only exist when your side isn't enjoying the advantage? Bigger picture your mom. Come, battle!" Right now, Ling Han's temper definitely wasn't good. The prodigies from the wide prosperity heaven had treated him with contempt first, and now they were even trying to screw him over. It would be a miracle if he could endure this. He lashed out in anger, and Hu Niu also roared as she unleashed her full battle prowess. A rock materialized in the air, screeching as it beat its wings and released its devastating aura. The Empress was no weaker, and she summoned all 9 of her doppelgangers. They were all monarch tiers, and they all unleashed their own celestial techniques. The 3 of them made up the main force of the calm peace heaven. Meanwhile, Yan Xianlu, Shan Jitong, Lao Song, and the others acted as supports. They unleashed some kind of formation, and their battle prowess wasn't weak, either. With a long roar, Yilin Feng led the prodigies from the wide prosperity heaven to engage in a ferocious counterattack. The 2 sides became locked in an intense battle. This was a fight between 2 heavens, so it was naturally as intense as could be. Both sides detested each other. Contrary to celestial medicines which could only be obtained by a single person, the true meaning of the great Tao could be shared and comprehended by everyone. However, the prodigies from the wide prosperity heaven didn't want to share this with the prodigies from the calm peace heaven, and the reverse was also true. The battle became increasingly heated. Even though Xu Yering tried her best to dissuade everyone, the best she could do was only to prevent deaths on either side. After all, she was only at the 5th severance. In terms of the number of monarch tiers, the calm peace heaven was naturally at a disadvantage. They only had a total of 6 monarch tiers. Meanwhile, the wide prosperity heaven had a total of 11 monarch tiers. However, Ling Han, Hu Niu, and the Empress were far too powerful. They stabilized the situation, and they allowed the calm peace heaven to have a chance at victory. "Celestial Maiden Shu, stop hesitating! Dispose of those trash!" The Emperor tiers from the wide prosperity heaven shouted. Without the formations of monarch tiers, they didn't have the right to participate in this kind of battle. It was during the severing mundane tier that they were the most inferior to monarch tiers. After advancing to the dividing soul tier, they could most likely hold their own. Xu Yering was still struck with indecision. It was clear that neither side was willing to back down. It was impossible for them to cooperate again. That being the case, it was better for her to act decisively and defeat the prodigies from the calm peace heaven. Otherwise, continuing on like this wouldn't lead to any result. "Haha, is this picking on the outnumbered?" someone said with a loud laugh. A figure suddenly dashed over. "Xiao!" With a wave of his hand, he released an indescribably fast arrow at a monarch tier from the wide prosperity heaven. This monarch tier was currently being suppressed by Hu Niu, and he seemed to be in a desperate situation. Upon seeing the nearing arrow, he couldn't help but roar and form a celestial seal with his hands. He then grabbed at the arrow. Pa! He caught the arrow, yet the arrow was far too quick. There was a flash of red as blood spurted from his hand. The arrow then slid through his hand and directly pierced his chest. The monarch humphed as he frantically shot back in retreat. However, the arrow had already pierced halfway through his chest. Fortunately, he had grabbed the arrow for a brief moment, and blocked most of its power. Otherwise, the might of this arrow would have been even greater. He instantly became pale, and his aura started to plummet. The person who had launched the sneak attack was none other than Wuming. The bow in his hands was a genuine celestial tool. Even though its power was limited by his cultivation level, the might of the arrow was still utterly terrifying. Wuming flashed a smile. This was an indescribably sinister and baleful smile. With a flash, he had already appeared behind the wounded monarch. You dare? Without even turning around, the monarch immediately launched a palm strike. He was a monarch, so even though he was wounded, and even though his battle prowess had fallen drastically, his attacks were still brimming with destructive power. Wuming opened his mouth, and a stunning scene ensued. Like a colossal tautai, his mouth actually widened to an unbelievable size. With a gulp, he then swallowed the monarch. The monarch had been swallowed whole. This? A cold chill shot down everyone's spine. This was far too harrowing. That was a mighty monarch. Yet he had been swallowed just like that. Not to mention whether eating people was moral or not, could Wuming even digest this monarch? Pun! 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 Numerous fist imprints started to appear on Wuming's abdomen. It was clear that the monarch was unleashing his fury inside Wuming's stomach. However, Wuming's stomach possessed terrifying toughness and elasticity, and it wouldn't break no matter what. A smile spread across Wuming's face as he patted his stomach. He then looked toward the others. Wherever he looked, those under his gaze couldn't help but feel a deep sense of apprehension. They felt like Wuming wasn't a person at all. Instead, he was a petrifying monster. Wuming! Xu Yaring roared in anger. She brandished her sword and charged at Wuming. He actually dared to attack members of the wide prosperity heaven before her. Moreover, he attacked a monarch with limitless potential, a monarch who could definitely become a celestial king. This caused her to become wild with fury. Shwa! Her sword slashed down. Wuming simply lifted the bow in his hand to parry. The bow rapidly expanded in size, growing from a foot long to 5 feet long. Clang! He blocked the strike from Xu Yaring. Why so angry? He asked in a calm voice. Xu Yaring became even more enraged. Boom! Flames erupted from her silken hair, and her entire body became a raging fireball. She appeared even more dazzling and radiant. With a whoosh, she launched another sword strike at Wuming. However, Wuming simply shook his head, and said, My battle with Tang Minglong already wasted too much time. I don't want to waste any more time on you. With a flash, he escaped from Xu Yaring at an incredible speed. He then grabbed at an Emperor. The Emperor roared in anger as he counterattacked with his full strength. However, with a simple gulp, Wuming swallowed this Emperor into his stomach. To say nothing of others, even Ling Han couldn't help but shed some cold sweat upon seeing this. This person was far too heartless and fearless. He even swallowed living people whole. Of course, he understood that Wuming definitely wasn't swallowing people to satisfy his appetite. Instead, he was doing so to increase his strength or physique. Hunyo crossed her arms and said, Disgusting! There was an expression of disgust on her face. Even though she was a glutton, she had never had any interest in eating humans. Wuming, I'm going to kill you! Xu Yaring roared as she chased after him. You already said that once, and I heard you loud and clear. No need to shout it again. You're almost about to burst my eardrums, Wuming said as he picked at his ears. He dashed away again, avoiding any conflict with Xu Yaring. At the same time, he continued to target other prodigies. His bow was far too powerful, and taking advantage of the conflict between the wide prosperity heaven and the calm peace heaven, he continued to target prodigies from the wide prosperity heaven. Moreover, he wouldn't need to launch sneak attacks on Emperor tiers at all. He could directly charge over and swallow them. At this moment, the prodigies from the wide prosperity heaven fell into complete disarray. They lost all intent to battle. Meanwhile, the prodigies from the calm peace heaven were brimming with battle intent. Even though Wuming's action of swallowing people was terrifying, was he not helping them right now? They would seize this opportunity to attack. Only a single person had joined the battle, yet he managed to turn the entire situation on its head. The prodigies from the wide prosperity heaven fled in complete disarray. At this moment, they didn't have the time nor effort to care about the true meaning of the great Tao. After all, if they lost their lives, what use was a treasure? Wuming suddenly turned to the prodigies of the calm peace heaven, and said, "Hee, it's your turn now!" There was a dangerous glint in his eyes. With a smack, he instantly swallowed an emperor tear from the calm peace heaven. His eyes were gleaming, and he appeared much like a primordial beast. Chapter 1972 Fine Details. Chapter 1972 Fine Details. Ling Han humped softly before slashing his sword at Wuming. Just then, he had no choice but to battle against the prodigies from the wide prosperity heaven. As such, he hadn't been able to target Wuming. Now that Xu Yaring was also chasing Wuming, he naturally had the freedom to also chase after him. "Brat, it's not your turn yet," Wuming said as he dashed aside. He was like a fish swimming against tumultuous currents. However, regardless of how violent the waves were, he could still swim through them with ease. Ling Han still had yet to recover his full battle prowess, so he couldn't stop Wuming at all. He could only watch on as Wuming opened his mouth to swallow another emperor tear from the calm peace heaven. "You have something I need," Wuming said as he stopped. He stared at Ling Han, and continued, "I have to leave this sumptuous meal until last so that I can slowly enjoy it to the fullest." Wuming had most likely sensed the Xianyin source water and the nine heavens flame. However, to be able to sense these two source powers while still at the fifth severance, the sensitivity of his divine sense was truly astonishing. Just who in the world is this Wuming? If Ling Han had heard the conversation between Wuming and Tang Minglong, he would have come to a sudden realization. Wuming was the reincarnation of a ninth heaven celestial king. So was it strange that he possessed some abilities that exceeded his cultivation level? In the past, he had been a supreme figure who could wantonly travel through the celestial realm. It would be truly strange if he didn't possess some unique abilities or powers. Ling Han, the Empress, Hu Niu, and Xu Yaring all chased after and attacked Wuming. By teaming up, the four of them were most likely invincible among those at the severing mundane tier. This was indeed the case. Wuming didn't stop to fight with them at all. Instead, he continued to use his movement techniques to evade them and attack others. He was like a slippery fish, and he was able to easily avoid their attacks. Even if he couldn't dodge their attacks, he would simply swing his bow to parry. He would then casually stroll over to attack other people. Ling Han and the others could only follow him in vain. They couldn't stop him at all. Ling Han had no option but to place Bewitching Maiden Ro into the Black Tower. At the same time, he couldn't help but feel astounded. They were both at the fifth severance, and Wuming's battle prowess wasn't especially strong, either. However, he could somehow manage to toy with all four of them. They couldn't continue like this. Ling Han slowed down his attacks, and started to carefully observe Wuming's movements. He gradually made some discoveries. Wuming was indeed at the same cultivation level as them. However, his grasp of regulations had already reached an incredibly refined state. He was well versed with each fine detail, and it was because of this that he could easily dismiss all of their attacks. However, this discovery couldn't help Ling Han at all. After all, he had no way of emulating Wuming. The other party's strength was built upon his profound grasp of regulations, and this was something that could only be mastered through countless years of cultivation. Or perhaps one needed to observe the true meaning of the Great Tao for countless days until they completely mastered the foundations of regulations. Ling Han couldn't help but feel astonished. Looking at Ji Wuming's flame of life, his age was only in the tens of thousands of years. This was very similar to him. However, his grasp of regulations was on a completely different level. The gulf between them was like the distance between heaven and earth. Ling Han was unable to accept this. Were there truly such heaven-defying freaks? They could achieve in a few years what others needed hundreds of millions of years or even billions of years to achieve? One had to realize that Ling Han was already a freak. In any case, if Ling Han knew that Ji Wuming was the reincarnation of a ninth heaven celestial king, he would definitely come to a sudden understanding. Ninth heaven celestial king. Perhaps they had lived for trillions of years, or perhaps they had lived for several epochs. Thus, would it be strange that they possessed such a fine grasp over regulations? The number of people became fewer and fewer. Moreover, no one dared to escape. After all, if they left the protection of Ling Han and the others, they would be easily caught by Ji Wuming, upon which they would be swallowed. However, even if they stayed, Ling Han and the others were still unable to guarantee their safety. They could only delay their inevitable deaths. The Emperor Tears couldn't help but feel grief and vexation. In the outside world, which of them wasn't a mighty and renowned being? Even if they didn't become a celestial king in the future, they could still at least become an ascending origin tier elite. Yet, they were actually suffering such a fate. How miserable! Only monarch tiers like Yan Xianlu, Shan Jitong, Lao Song, and the others could survive. Without the interference of the wide prosperity heaven, they were most likely strong enough to exchange a few strikes with Ji Wuming. Thus, they could hold on until Ling Han and the others rushed over to help them. In just 1 hour, only 7 people remained, not counting Ji Wuming. Moreover, all of them were monarch tiers. "I urge you to give up," Ji Wuming said in a calm voice. "You people can't stop me. Moreover, I don't want to waste my trump cards on you either. Why don't we all sit down to observe the true meaning of the Great Tao? In your dreams!" Xu Yaring roared in fury. She continued to ferociously attack Ji Wuming. Ling Han was also brimming with fighting spirit. It was far too difficult to come across such a challenging opponent. Indeed, fighting against Ji Wuming would also bring him many benefits. After all, Ji Wuming was a master in manipulating regulations. As long as Ling Han could grasp the fine details of regulations, his strength would definitely see a noticeable increase. Meanwhile, the true meaning of the Great Tao was a treasure that could help him grasp these fine details. Yan Xianlu and the others also started to attack Ji Wuming. However, even with 7 monarch tiers attacking him, Ji Wuming still appeared as composed and relaxed as could be. In fact, he would even pose a deadly threat to Shan Jitong and Lao Song from time to time. These two were the weakest among the 7 monarch tiers. In fact, they could barely withstand a single strike from Ji Wuming. Once they were attacked, they would be plunged into a perilous situation of life and death. In just a short moment, the two of them were already drenched in blood. They appeared as miserable as could be. Yan Xianlu wanted to draw the two of them into his spatial god tool. Yet this would be a huge blow to their confidence and dignity. Moreover, this wasn't a secure method either. After all, what if his spatial god tool were snatched by Ji Wuming? At that time, Shan Jitong and Lao Song would face certain death. Thus, with the addition of these 2 monarch tiers, Ling Han and the others' battle prowess fell by a significant amount. They were completely suppressed by Ji Wuming. Both his battle experience and intuition were incredible, and this was most likely the result of having engaged in countless battles. His reactions were extremely natural, and he didn't need to think about them at all. His body would reflexively choose the most suitable action. Ling Han became increasingly puzzled, and he asked, "Who in the world are you?" "Me? A nameless pawn," Ji Wuming replied in a calm voice. He then glanced at Xu Yaring and said, "This is my last time suggesting this. Why don't you stop?" Ling Han was the first to stop. Even though he wanted to defeat Ji Wuming, he truly couldn't find any way to do so. Of course, if this were a one-on-one battle, he wouldn't fear Ji Wuming at all. First of all, could Ji Wuming tear through his defenses? At that time, he could freely unleash the might of his 9 heavens flame and Xianyin source water. Most importantly, his battle prowess still had yet to fully recover. At the same time, he couldn't draw on the power of the Black Tower. With Ling Han stopping, the Empress and Hunyo naturally stopped as well, even though they felt extremely displeased about this. Following them, Yan Xianlu and the others also stopped. Only Xu Yaring continued to attack Ji Wuming. She was beside herself with fury. Beneath the azure mountains, rabbit spirits confused and flustered. Rivers of lightning flow aside, dragons of flood unleash their might, Ji Wuming suddenly said. You! Xu Yaring stammered as her expression changed drastically. Her attacks suddenly stopped, and her slender figure started to tremble uncontrollably. She appeared as emotional as could be. Chapter 1973 Astonishing Identity. Chapter 1973 Astonishing Identity. Ji Wuming flashed a smile and asked, Girl, you're not going to attack me anymore? Lord! Xu Yaring exclaimed as she suddenly fell to her knees, with tears streaming down her cheeks. She was beside herself with emotion. What's going on? This battle has suddenly become a family reunion? Judging by her prostration, Xu Yaring will probably smile and accept her fate even if Ji Wuming wants to kill her. In fact, it seems as if she's Ji Wuming's subordinate. However, as a supreme monarch tier, how can she be someone else's subordinate? Moreover, she clearly didn't recognize him at first. At the very least, not his current identity. Only when he recited those lines did she finally come to a realization and shed tears. This Ji Wuming. Who in the world is he? Not only that, but this Xu Yaring most likely has another identity as well. Ling Han frowned and said, Instead of having a happy little reunion, perhaps you should explain this to everyone. You don't have the right to know, Ji Wuming said in a calm voice. He stared at Ling Han, and a golden speck materialized in his eyes. His voice was meaningful as he said, Apart from two source powers of heaven and earth, there also seems to be something else with you. Moreover, its value is even greater. Because even I can't see through it. Ling Han was stunned. Just what kind of freak was he? A value even greater than his source powers. Ji Wuming had definitely discovered the existence of the Black Tower. However, Small Tower had once told him that the Black Tower couldn't be discovered unless he used it before celestial kings. Of course, this was referring to low-level celestial kings. However, Ji Wuming naturally wasn't a high-level celestial king. Instead, he was only a fifth severance cultivator. That being the case, how had he discovered the existence of the Black Tower? Yan Xianlu, Shan Jitong, and the others were also astonished. Ling Han actually possessed two source powers of heaven and earth. These were source powers of heaven and earth, things that were as valuable as divine metal. Even celestial kings could only dream of such treasures. Yet, as a severing mundane tier cultivator, Ling Han already possessed source powers? And two at that? This was inconceivable. Moreover, he even possessed a treasure that was more valuable than the source powers of heaven and earth. What could it be? Yan Xianlu and the others were unable to fathom this. Ling Han composed himself and asked, Reincarnation of a celestial king? He wasn't only looking at Ji Wuming, but also at Xu Yaring. Since he suspected Tang Minglong of being a reincarnated celestial king, why couldn't Ji Wuming and Xu Yaring also be reincarnated celestial kings? Ji Wuming shook his head, and it was clear that he didn't want to say anything more. He simply stared at Ling Han with his gleaming eyes, saying, Something that even I can't see through. Such kind of treasure. Ha ha ha, I have some confidence now. He retracted his gaze before walking up to the stone tablet. He then sat down and started to comprehend it. His actions were bold, and he didn't put up any defenses. However, upon sitting down, his back was like a towering mountain that soared into the heavens. This was a mountain that one could only gaze up at. This was a mountain that no one dared to attack. This was a kind of aura, a profoundly domineering aura. In his previous life, this person was definitely a paramount celestial king, someone who stood at the pinnacle of cultivation. Ling Han said in his mind. He then communicated with Small Tower. What do you think about this person? Ling Han asked. He's extraordinary, very extraordinary, Small Tower said in a cautious voice. This was extremely rare, with Small Tower often being proud and relaxed, and also taking joy in teasing him. It was truly rare that it showed such caution. His divine fetus is developing toward a state of perfection, Small Tower added. What does that mean? Ling Han asked. A divine fetus is born if one has a celestial king ancestor, and their bloodline suddenly returns to this ancestral state, giving them a wisp of celestial king power, Small Tower explained. It was rare that it didn't use this opportunity to scold Ling Han for being ignorant and ill-informed. Whatever regulations the celestial king cultivated is whatever regulations their descendant will obtain. This was very easy to understand. For example, chickens could only lay chicken eggs. If they suddenly laid a duck egg, that would definitely be the work of the duck next door. However, the divine fetus of this person possesses extremely varied and complex powers. Theoretically speaking, it shouldn't be like this, Small Tower said in puzzlement. However, with this person, all kinds of divine fetus powers are fusing together, becoming the foundation of his Tao. It's as if his divine fetus can absorb the Tao of all celestial kings. With the knowledge and wisdom of so many predecessors, you can try to imagine just how profound his foundations are. Why do I urge you to obtain more source powers of heaven and earth before becoming a celestial king? It's so that you can solidify your foundations. That way, you can easily soar to new heights after becoming a celestial king. This person is doing the exact same thing. The celestial king tier is divided into 9 heavens, with each subsequent minor tier allowing one to ascend to a new heaven. However, if one has already grasped all regulations in the world when they advance to the celestial king tier, perhaps they can even kill 3rd heaven celestial kings while still at the 1st heaven. If this were said in public, perhaps others would treat them as fools, who didn't know that there existed a strict hierarchy of power in the celestial king tier. 2nd heaven celestial kings could definitely crush those at the 1st heaven. This was equivalent to dividing soul tier cultivators pummeling severing mundane tier cultivators. This was like a father beating their son. The son could do nothing but endure the beating. Now, however, someone was claiming that a 1st heaven celestial king could not only defeat a 3rd heaven celestial king, but they could even kill them? Was this not a hilarious joke? However, Ling Han didn't look like laughing at all. Wuming had definitely been a celestial king in his previous life. Moreover, he had definitely been a high-level celestial king. After reincarnating, was he not aiming to become the most powerful in the world? This was only speculation, yet Ling Han had indeed hit the nail on the head. Ling Han was burning with fighting spirit. He definitely had to defeat this person. He had to defeat him fair and square. He wouldn't borrow the power of the Black Tower, nor would he use something like the red-spotted green bamboo. This person could raise his martial intent to a higher level. That's the right attitude, Small Tower said with a nod. It gave affirmation to Ling Han's intentions. Don't spy on my thoughts, you freak tower! If I weren't connected to your mind, do you think I would want to read your dirty thoughts? Small Tower said in retort. Ling Han ignored Small Tower. He then strode over to the stone tablet, and also sat down. He started to comprehend the true meaning of the Great Tao. Under Ling Han's lead, the Empress and Hunyao also walked over. Ling Han then released Bewitching Maiden Ro from the Black Tower. Apart from them, Yan Xianlu and the others all walked before the stone tablet. It was just that Yan Xianlu and the others were still filled with apprehension and caution. They were afraid that Wuming might suddenly leap over and attack them. As if reading their thoughts, Wuming suddenly turned around to flash a smile at them. Wuming and Lao Song almost wet their pants in fright. Meanwhile, Yan Xianlu also leaped up and prepared to defend himself. Wuming turned back around and continued to comprehend the true meaning of the Great Tao. It was as if he were only trying to frighten Yan Xianlu and the others. However, after experiencing this, Yan Xianlu and the others didn't dare to venture any closer. They had to maintain a safe distance from that freak. Otherwise, what would they do if they were eaten? Yet, It was necessary that they walked closer if they wanted to see the true meaning of the great Tao clearly. With some mysterious power of heaven and earth concealing the stone tablet, they naturally couldn't see the symbols clearly from far away. Yan Qianlu and the others were extremely frustrated by this. Meanwhile, Xu Yering was like a maid as she respectfully kneeled behind Ji Wuming. This was an incredible sight. Was this still the second most powerful severing mundane tier cultivator of the wide prosperity heaven? Was this still the most beautiful woman of the wide prosperity heaven? After just 3 days, Ji Wuming stood back up. He glanced at Ling Han and said, "Take care. Next time we meet, I'll collect all of your treasures from you." Ling Han opened his eyes and said in retort, "After defeating you, I'll spare your life." In comparison, his words were much more domineering and confident. So what if Ling Han spared his life? Regardless of how he chased and pursued, he would never be able to catch up to Ling Han. "Ha ha!" Ji Wuming roared with laughter as he confidently strode away. Chapter 1974 Heavenly Venerate. Chapter 1974 Heavenly Venerate. Ling Han turned his gaze to Xu Yering. Xu Yering hadn't left with Ji Wuming. Instead, she simply watched him leave with an expression of respect and reverence. Only when he disappeared from sight did she change from kneeling to sitting. At the same time, the confidence and relaxed expression of a supreme prodigy returned to her face. This was the true Xu Yering. "Lady Xu, who in the world is this Ji Wuming?" Ling Han asked. Xu Yering smiled and replied, "I'm sure you can guess. He's naturally an extremely mighty person." It was clear that she wasn't willing to talk about Ji Wuming's true identity. Ling Han could only guess. "Eighth Heaven Celestial King?" He focused on Xu Yering's expression, and he saw a hint of disdain flash across her eyes. "Ninth Heaven Celestial King," he said in certainty. Xu Yering didn't say anything. She ignored Ling Han, and she instead started to focus on the stone tablet that recorded the true meaning of the Great Tao. "Ninth Heaven Celestial King." Ling Han repeated this in his mind. This was absolutely astonishing. Why did a Ninth Heaven Celestial King need to reincarnate? After all, they were already standing at the pinnacle of the world. Perhaps he desired to suppress fellow Ninth Heaven Celestial Kings and become genuinely invincible. So he resolutely abandoned his paramount cultivation, and decided to start from scratch again? Let alone becoming a Ninth Heaven Celestial King, even becoming a First Heaven Celestial King was filled with obstacles and dangers. Thus, what if he couldn't return to the same height again? After all, it wasn't a foregone conclusion that a Celestial King could definitely return to the same cultivation level after reincarnating. Cultivation was a heaven-defying matter in itself, so those who reincarnated to cultivate from scratch would naturally be targeted by the heavens. Their heavenly tribulation would become significantly more difficult. Moreover, who could guarantee that they wouldn't be killed during this process of recultivation? Even Ling Han didn't have the courage to sever his own fruits of cultivation and start from scratch again. After reaching the pinnacle, just how strong would one's willpower need to be to sever their own cultivation? Small Tower, is reaching the level of Ninth Heaven Celestial King truly the pinnacle of the celestial realm? Ling Han asked. He refused to believe that Ji Wuming had severed his own cultivation simply to become the most powerful Ninth Heaven Celestial King. After all, with so much time on their hands, Ninth Heaven Celestial Kings could definitely mend the imperfections in their cultivation, all the way until they reached a state of perfection. Unless, this was to prepare for a foundational transformation, and to prepare for a higher cultivation level. As such, there was only a single possibility. That was, the level of Ninth Heaven Celestial King wasn't the true pinnacle of the celestial realm. Small Tower paused for a moment before saying, "Above Ninth Heaven Celestial Kings are the paramount beings of the world. Heavenly Venerates! Heavenly Venerate!" Ling Han's heart jumped when he heard this. He suddenly recalled Small Tower referring to the previous owner of the Black Tower as Heavenly Venerate. Above Ninth Heaven Celestial Kings were the paramount beings of the world, Heavenly Venerates. They were the venerable rulers of the world. "What kind of existence is this?" Ling Han asked. His mouth felt slightly dry and he said, "After all, ninth heaven's celestial kings already enjoy an equal standing with heaven and earth. They're transcendent above the great Tao, and they can manipulate both heaven and earth. With a single thought, they can materialize a clone anywhere in the world. Moreover, this clone possesses a power equivalent to ninth heaven's celestial kings. Even if one simply mentions their title, this will still trigger a reaction from heaven and earth," Small Tower said in a leisurely voice. Ling Han composed himself, yet his limbs were starting to feel slightly cold. "So, the owner of the Black Tower was a heavenly Venerate, yet he passed away." "That's correct," Small Tower replied. It didn't ignore Ling Han's question. Instead, it answered him in a frank manner. "Even heavenly Venerates can pass away. These are beings who are transcendent above the great Tao. Anyhow, no wonder the indestructible Heaven Scroll is so freakishly powerful. It managed to attract both the Nine Heavens Flame and the Xianyin Source Water. As it turns out, this is a cultivation technique that's transcendent above the great Tao." However, the more Ling Han learned about the power of heavenly Venerates, the more he was unable to fathom how such an existence could possibly die. Even if they wanted to commit suicide, that would probably still be impossible, right? There was no longer any power in the world that could erase such beings. "There's no need for you to mull over this now. Raise your cultivation, and you'll eventually understand everything in the future," Small Tower said. Ling Han nodded in understanding. Small Tower was extremely good at keeping secrets, so it would be useless to push for any more information. It was clear that Wuming had severed his own cultivation so that he could aim for the title of Heavenly Venerate. He wanted to reach the true pinnacle of the world. Both his courage and resolve were astounding, so it was no wonder that Shu Yaring treated him with such respect and reverence. Hang on. Then why did Shu Yaring reincarnate as well? Also, what about Tang Milong? Perhaps they all want to become heavenly venerates? After answering a question, many more new questions arose. This caused him to feel extremely frustrated. Whatever. Forget about it. He returned his attention to the stone tablet. Wuming's grasp of regulations had clearly reached an astonishing height already. As such, he only needed 3 days to completely digest the true meaning of the great Tao recorded on this stone tablet. Ling Han naturally couldn't emulate such a feat. He was genuinely at the severing mundane tier, so he didn't have the experience from a previous life or of several epochs. There was simply no way for him to compete with Wuming. After half a year, Shu Yaring also stood up. She glanced at Ling Han, and there was some slight change in her expression. There was a hint of darkness, yet she ultimately didn't do anything. She gracefully descended the mountain. When she turned around, Ling Han also opened his eyes. A faint smile tugged at the corners of his lips. If Shu Yaring had attacked him just then, he wouldn't have shown mercy either. He would have unleashed his full power to kill her. He returned his attention to the true meaning of the great Tao again, continuing to solidify his grasp on the regulation of slaughter. After a full 13 years, Ling Han finally completed his comprehension. However, he still hadn't managed to fully comprehend this true meaning of the great Tao yet. Even so, he had finally managed to commit each symbol to memory. Of course, if one asked him to draw these symbols now, he definitely couldn't do so. These were symbols that could only be perceived by intuition. They couldn't be passed on to another person. Heaven and earth didn't allow this. He had once thought about digging the stone tablet up and placing it inside the Black Tower. However, he had discovered that this was impossible. The stone tablet was connected to the entire mountain, so if he wanted to take it, he would have to take the entire mountain. If this mountain were composed of ordinary rock, Ling Han wouldn't mind taking it. Indeed, he could draw it into the Black Tower with a simple wave. However, this place was far too peculiar, so he couldn't take this mountain at all. As such, he spent a full 13 years to commit the symbols of the great Tao to memory. Upon seeing Hun Yo, the Empress, and bewitching maiden Rose still comprehending the true meaning of the great Tao, Ling Han decided to enter the Black Tower first. He started to cultivate under the reincarnation tree. From this, he could also determine that Hu Niu wasn't the reincarnation of a celestial king. Otherwise, with the Tao foundation of her previous life, would she need so long to comprehend the true meaning of the great Tao? Under the reincarnation tree, 700,000 years passed by in a flash. In the outside world, only a mere 20 years had passed. Ling Han exited the Black Tower. He had finally achieved initial mastery of the true meaning of the great Tao. Indeed, this was only initial mastery, and not comprehensive mastery. Meanwhile, Hu Niu and the others were still committing the true meaning of the great Tao to memory. Ling Han didn't disturb them, and he entered the Black Tower again. He retrieved a piece of Celestial King Bloodstone, and started to compare this with the true meaning of the great Tao. He continued to mull over the regulation of slaughter. Another 10 years passed in the outside world, and this was equivalent to over 300,000 years under the reincarnation tree. At this moment, Hu Niu and the Empress finally completed their comprehension. They had finally committed the true meaning of the great Tao to memory. Because bewitching Maiden Ro was still comprehending the stone tablet, Ling Han drew Hu Niu and the Empress into the Black Tower first. They started to investigate the regulation of slaughter together. However, Hu Niu felt extremely displeased. Why did they have to wait for that stupid bewitching woman? Yet, Ling Han and the Empress didn't say anything, so she could only obediently enter the Black Tower to comprehend the regulation of slaughter. Fortunately, this was a fresh matter for her, so she was extremely keen and excited. She didn't feel bored at all. And thus, another 50 years passed in the outside world. Bewitching Maiden Ro finally stood up. Meanwhile, Yan Xianlu, Shan Jitong, and the others had already left more than 20 years ago. This was the gulf between them. Chapter 1975 Second Peak. Chapter 1975 Second Peak. Once bewitching Maiden Ro finished her comprehension, Ling Han immediately drew her into the Black Tower so that she could solidify her Tao foundations. Meanwhile, he, the Empress, and Hu Niu started to descend the mountain. Counting from the day that Wuming had left, over 80 years had already passed. As such, it was hard to say whether the treasures of the two other peaks had already been taken. Similarly, it was hard to say whether someone had already obtained the fiery flame lightning strike wood. Or perhaps it had already escaped from this heaven and earth. The three of them were extremely careful as they descended the mountain. In fact, they were even more alert than before. This was because the gravitational force was far too great. Moreover, they were heading down, so it was even easier to fall by accident. After more than a month, they finally managed to descend the mountain. "Are we going to head to the two other peaks now, or are we going to venture further into the valley?" the Empress asked. "Let's have a look around the two other peaks first," Ling Han replied after pondering for a moment. "First of all, the valley is far too large, so without any guidance, we might not find the fiery flame lightning strike wood even if we spend 1,000,000 years looking around. Second of all, what if the fiery flame lightning strike wood is on one of the two mountain peaks?" Hu Niu tugged at Ling Han's hands and said, "Then let's hurry up and go." She started to drag him along. After walking for a while, a humanoid monster that had countless spikes on its head suddenly appeared before them. "Let Niu deal with it!" Hu Niu exclaimed as she jumped forward. She had only just grasped a small portion of the regulation of slaughter, so she was itching to test it out. "Xiao!" A burst of murderous aura transformed into a sword ray as it swept forward. With a crack, the humanoid monster instantly fell apart. It was the Empress who had attacked. "Arg! Detestable! Detestable! Far too detestable!" Hu Niu screamed in anger. "Why are you always stealing Niu's things?" The Empress retracted her finger and said, "Was your name written on the monster's head? So you're allowed to steal my prey because of this?" Hu Niu asked in anger. The Empress forcefully suppressed her smile, and she nodded with a serious expression. She was purposefully messing around with Hu Niu. Sure enough, Hu Niu started to jump up and down in frustration. She was like a small monkey. Ling Han couldn't help but smile. In terms of strength, Hu Niu was indeed slightly superior to the Empress. In terms of intelligence, however, the Empress was far superior to Hu Niu. After all, she had enjoyed the position of an Empress for countless years. As such, she was extremely familiar with all kinds of tactics. All right, stop complaining now. There are heaps of monsters for you to kill here, Ling Han said in consolation. Hu Niu pouted as she clung on to Ling Han. She then stuck her tongue out and made a face at the Empress. It was as if she were looking down on her. The three of them continued forward. Sure enough, another monster appeared before them. This time, however, it was Ling Han who attacked it first. A burst of regulation transformed into a sword light as it slashed forward, instantly killing the monster. Ling Han, you're also bad. Niu isn't going to play with you anymore. Hu Niu leaned over to bite his ear. Ling Han roared with laughter. He patted Hu Niu's back and said, "There are many more chances ahead." More monsters appeared before them, and Hu Niu finally had the opportunity to attack. The destructive ability of the regulation of slaughter was truly terrifying. Moreover, they had obtained the true meaning of this great Tao, so this elevated the might of the regulation of slaughter by another level. Their cultivation level clearly hadn't increased, yet their power had indeed increased. Sure enough, cultivation level isn't absolute. The stronger one's grasp of regulations, the more powerful their battle prowess. The three of them happily continued forward. They continued to battle with monsters to improve their understanding of this regulation. After all, practice was the key to improving its might. Several days later, they arrived at the foot of the second mountain peak. Like the previous mountain peak, this mountain peak towered into the clouds. Looking up, one couldn't see its summit. They started to ascend the mountain. However, they immediately realized that something was off. Countless different fork roads appeared before them. How should we advance? Hu Niu asked. She was completely stumped by this. Just randomly pick a path, Ling Han said. Since they didn't know which path was correct, they would naturally just pick a random one. The three of them randomly picked a path and continued to advance. Unexpectedly, this was a long and winding path, and after 3 days, they discovered that it actually led to a dead end. A cliff appeared before them, and looking down, all they could see was a bottomless abyss. It was as pitch black as could be. They shrunk back, and started to walk back the way that they had come, eventually returning to where they had started. They then chose another path, which was similarly long and winding. Fortunately, after walking for 2 days, this path forked into 3 more paths. If this path is also incorrect, then picking either of the 3 paths will only cause us to venture further and further along the path of incorrectness. If we blindly advance, we might be stuck here for all eternity. This is most likely a formation. The 3 of them returned to the starting point again. Against the formation, it would be useless no matter how many times they tried their luck. They would only be led into a pit. If they wanted to ascend this mountain, they would have to crack this formation first. They descended the mountain and started to observe it from below. Hu Niu hated using her brains, so it wasn't long before she started to yawn in boredom. She lay down on Ling Han's back and started to sleep. Meanwhile, the Empress and Ling Han started to discuss and exchange their findings. The combined wisdom of 2 people was naturally greater than that of a single person. They continued to enter the Black Tower, where they could use the help of the reincarnation tree. This was a significant advantage. After only 3 days, they had already come up with a preliminary plan. They had already spent almost 300 years under the reincarnation tree. The 3 of them started to ascend the mountain again. They chose a path, and after advancing for a single day, this path forked into 2 separate paths. They chose the left path, and after advancing for another day, this path forked into another 3 paths. They chose the middle path. After walking for yet another day, this path forked into 4 separate paths. Just like that, the number of forks in the paths started to continually increase. Eventually, the paths would fork into several hundred or even several thousand paths. However, Ling Han and the Empress weren't astonished by this. Instead, they were delighted. This was completely in line with their deduction. They had indeed chosen the correct paths. A dozen or so days passed, and a figure suddenly appeared before them. It was none other than Yan Xianlu. "Brother Yan!" Ling Han shouted. "Brother Ling!" Yan Xianlu said in greeting as he turned around. "You guys have also come." He didn't know that Ling Han and the others had only used a single year to catch up to him. Otherwise, he would have definitely been shocked to the core. This was because he had spent several years to finally discover a pattern. However, even after arriving here, he still needed to analyze each fork in the paths several times before he could determine the correct path. Ling Han nodded in satisfaction. They had already caught up to someone who had set off 20 years ago. As long as the remaining paths were long enough, they still had a chance to catch up to everyone else. After all, the reincarnation tree could provide them with a huge advantage in this kind of situation. It wasn't long before they arrived at a new fork in the path. Ling Han and the others chose a path without any hesitation at all. Ling Han and the Empress were filled with confidence. Meanwhile, Hunyo didn't rack her brains at all. She simply followed their lead. "Brother Ling, don't you need to analyze the situation at all?" Yan Xianlu asked. He had pondered for a moment before hurriedly walking after them. "Huh!" Ling Han rubbed his nose. Hadn't they finished analyzing the situation long ago? Upon seeing Ling Han's expression, Yan Xianlu came to a sudden realization. "It can't be that you've already figured it out, right? So you don't even need to think before choosing the correct path?" he exclaimed in astonishment. "It's not the same for you?" Ling Han asked. "Fuck. You're all freaks." Yan Xianlu felt extremely vexed. He felt that it was already a great achievement that he had chosen the correct paths. However, the further he ventured, the more he would need to analyze. As a result, he would also need to spend more time to determine the correct path. Traveling along a path would only take a single day. However, analyzing the forks and determining the correct paths would require several months, or even an entire year. "Brother Ling, I'll follow you guys." Chapter 1976 Heaven Destroying 9 Swords. Chapter 1976 Heaven Destroying 9 Swords. Before Ling Han, Yan Xianlu had no option but to admit that there were prodigies more freakish than him in the world. Ling Han's cultivation talent was superior to his, and his battle prowess was also superior to his. In the domain of alchemy, Ling Han more so possessed the potential to become a grandmaster. Right now, even his talent in formations was miles ahead of Yan Xianlu's. How could such a profoundly talented person exist in the world? Following Ling Han and the Empress lead, they didn't need to stop at any of the forks on the path. This naturally increased their speed by a significant amount. 2 months later, several more people appeared before them. This included Shu Yaring and the survivors from the Wide Prosperity Heaven. For example, Lu Jie and his younger sister. Shu Yaring involuntarily furrowed her beautiful brows upon seeing Ling Han and the others. She was slightly astonished. She had been certain that Ling Han and the others would need an exorbitant amount of time to comprehend the true meaning of the Great Tao. Now, however, they had actually caught up to her. What did this signify? This signified that Ling Han and the others could crack this formation far quicker than her. She was completely stunned. Others didn't know, but she was naturally clear that she had been a seventh heaven celestial king in her previous life. Because she had lived for so long, she was naturally well versed with many different Tao of the world. Now, however, she had actually been beaten by a measly severing mundane tier cultivator. Humph! The prodigies from the Wide Prosperity Heaven all wore unfriendly expressions when they saw Ling Han and the others. Half of the prodigies from the Wide Prosperity Heaven had been massacred by Wuming, while some others had ventured down the wrong paths. They hadn't been able to meet Shu Yaring and follow her. Thus, there were currently only 7 of them in total. "What are you harumphing about?" Hunyo said with a glare. "Who's not happy? Come and fight me!" No one answered her. Hunyo's fierceness was already deeply engraved in everyone's mind. Of the prodigies from the Wide Prosperity Heaven, only Shu Yaring could rival her. As for the others, they were no match for her. Neither side communicated with each other, and it wasn't long before they reached the next fork in the path. The prodigies from the wide prosperity heaven all stopped in their tracks. With Shu Yering as their leader, they would analyze the situation to determine the correct path. However, Ling Han and the others didn't stop at all. They directly chose a path. Fuck! Shu Yering and the others were stunned. What in the world was going on? Didn't they need to determine the correct path? This was impossible. To determine the correct path with a single glance? What kind of analysis ability was this? Follow them! Shu Yering immediately said. Even if this were the incorrect path, they could still immediately retreat. The memory of Celestials naturally didn't need to be questioned. They activated their movement techniques, and immediately followed behind Ling Han and the others. After a day of travel, they arrived before another fork in the path. With the eyesight of Celestials, they could easily determine how many paths there were with a single glance. Coincidentally, there was one more path than the previous fork. In other words, this was the correct path. Had Ling Han and the others guessed correctly? Could there be such a great coincidence? Moreover, was it possible that they had guessed their way up to here? This was far too terrifying. Just what kind of freak was he? However, since this was the case, they would naturally follow behind Ling Han and the others. The prodigies from the wide prosperity heaven were all thinking this. After all, this would help them save some time. After passing several forks, Shu Yering and the others continued to follow behind Ling Han. They were enjoying the fruits of his labor. Why are you still following us? Hun Yo asked in displeasure. Does your family own these paths? Are others not allowed to walk them? A monarch tier from the wide prosperity heaven asked in retort. He naturally wasn't willing to admit that they were enjoying the fruits of Ling Han's labor. All right then, Ling Han said with a nod. After arriving at the next fork, he stopped and said, You guys first. Shu Yering and the others exchanged glances with each other. Us first? However, they naturally didn't need to back down. They ignored Ling Han and started to analyze the paths. Ling Han snickered before choosing a path. Upon seeing this, Shu Yering and the others hurriedly followed after him. They didn't feel any shame at all. You people are far too shameless! Hun Yo shouted. Ling Han smiled and said to her, Don't worry, I've got this. Upon arriving at the next fork, Ling Han suddenly grabbed the Empress and the others before activating a movement technique. He surprisingly transformed into 4 shadows, each of which sprinted down a different path. Shu Yering and the others instantly stopped in their tracks. They didn't know which shadow to follow. How was this possible? Ling Han was only at the 5th severance, so even if his cultivation could rival those at the Yang Soul, and even if his battle prowess could suppress those at the Yin Soul, he still wasn't a dividing soul tier elite. Only those at the dividing soul tier could separate their souls to create clones of themselves. It was impossible to tell these clones apart from the actual person. This was far too strange. However, they didn't know that Ling Han had actually taken advantage of the power of time of the Black Tower. He had infused himself with this power, allowing time to slow down by several hundredfold. What looked like an instant to others was much more time for him. During this time, he had sprinted down 4 different paths. To others, however, it was as if he had suddenly summoned 3 clones of himself. What could they do? Did they have to separate? However, what if Ling Han did this again? If they divided the 7 people up into 4 different groups, one group would only have a single person. That being the case, how could they split up again? Forget about it. Let's analyze the paths ourselves. They started to rack their own brains. Ahead of them, Ling Han flashed a smile. Trying to ride on my coattails? After walking for a dozen or so days, the path before them finally opened up. There were no more forks on the road, and there was only a wide and magnificent path. At the end of this path was a towering and majestic palace. The 4 of them walked over, only to discover that this palace was only a shell of its former self. It was in complete disarray. In the past, this had definitely been a spectacular structure. Its size was absolutely astonishing. Now, however, not even a single blade of grass could be found. All that was left was broken and naked stone. In a gigantic plaza, there rested a towering stone tablet. Engraved on it was a dense array of words. Right now, a short man was standing before this stone tablet. His hair was white, and he wore an expression of slight concentration as he gazed up at the stone tablet. However, he immediately turned around when Ling Han and the others arrived behind him. Was this not Tang Minglong? He hadn't gone to the mountain peak on the left, and he had instead directly come here. If Ling Han had known that Tang Minglong had fought with Ji Wuming before, he could have guessed that he hadn't gone to the mountain peak on the left because of Ji Wuming. Now, however, he couldn't help but feel slightly curious. Why had Tang Minglong come here first? One had to realize that the left mountain peak was the closest to the entrance. Even though the central mountain peak was in the center of the valley, it wasn't actually facing the entrance directly. Who would have thought that you guys would arrive here first? Tang Minglong said in emotion. He was well aware of Xu Yaring's background. Yet, this reincarnated celestial king had actually been surpassed by a few juniors. He couldn't help but feel surprised. Ling Han simply smiled in reply. If others didn't target him, he wouldn't target them either. He walked over to observe the stone tablet. Heaven-destroying 9 swords! 4 words immediately surged over from the stone tablet. In fact, they transformed into 4 streaks of light, 4 bursts of sword xia as they slashed down at Ling Han. Boom! Ling Han raised his arms to block. Screech! He was immediately pushed back by the overwhelming power of the sword chi. Thud, thud, thud. He retreated several hundred steps before finally coming to a stop. At this distance, the words on the stone tablet instantly became blurry. He could only determine that there were words engraved into it. Heaven-destroying 9 swords? Ling Han murmured to himself as he stood there. A smile spread across his face, and he said, So, this means that if I can't stand closer to it, I don't have the right to practice this sword technique? Chapter 1977 Sword Technique. Chapter 1977 Sword Technique. The Empress, Hun Yo, and Yan Xianlu also wore expressions of eagerness. Prodigies would seldom admit defeat. Ling Han released Bewitching Maiden Ro from the Black Tower as well, and the 5 of them all walked toward the stone tablet. 1. Flashes of sword light slashed over again. However, Ling Han was prepared this time, and he immediately waved his right hand, launching a counterattack at the flashes of sword light. He wasn't reactively defending. With Ling Han's example, the Empress and the others also emulated his actions. They all unleashed powerful celestial techniques. Pun 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 pu! There were flashes of brilliant light as the first wave of attacks from the stone tablet ended. Even though they had been prepared, they were still sent sliding back far into the distance. None of them had managed to advance. These flashes of sword light were extremely overwhelming and powerful. However, even though they had all been pushed back, the distance that they had been pushed back was different. For example, Ling Han had been pushed back the least. This time, he had only been pushed back 200 or so steps. After him was Hun Yo, who had been pushed back a dozen or so steps more than him. After her, the Empress had been pushed back 7 more steps. Yan Xianlu fell a further 20 or so steps behind. Last was Bewitching Maiden Ro, who had been pushed back a whopping 600 steps. It was because Ling Han had already faced this attack once that he had been pushed back the least. Discounting him, the strength of the others was clear for all to see. Come again! Hun Yo shouted in excitement. She immediately dashed forward. Ling Han and the others also charged forward again. Pun pun pun! Each time they charged forward, they would be pushed back by the attacks of the stone tablet. However, Ling Han, Hun Yo, and the Empress were being pushed back a shorter and shorter distance. In other words, they were continually advancing with each charge. Meanwhile, Yan Xianlu and Bewitching Maiden Ro were also advancing. However, their advance was incredibly slow, especially Bewitching Maiden Ro's. Tang Minglong involuntarily stroked his beard upon seeing this. His wrinkles became less bunched together, and it was as if he were feeling extremely delighted. It was not in vain for me to battle against that person and exhaust several of his trump cards. When these young ones grow up, They'll definitely become the main pillars to resist the storm of darkness, he said in his mind. At this moment, he suddenly clutched at his chest. His body shuddered, and his face instantly became as white as a sheet. Blood seeped from his fingers. Even after reincarnating and recultivating, and even though we're both at the 5th severance, the gulf between him and me is still so great. Who would have thought? I didn't die while battling against the storm of darkness, yet I'll actually die here. So be it. I can lay to eternal rest in my homeland, so I can at least die with a smile. Moreover, as long as these youths can grow up, what does it matter even if I die? Did I not battle in that place for countless years to protect this piece of land? He turned around, preventing Ling Han and the others from witnessing his miserable state. With a leap, he quickly vanished without a trace. Just like Ji Wuming had said before, it was impossible for Tang Minglong to kill him. Meanwhile, he would only need to exhaust a single trump card to kill Tang Minglong. However, Ji Wuming had clearly miscalculated, and he had ended up exhausting more than one trump card. This was also why Ji Wuming hadn't targeted Ling Han just then, even though he knew that Ling Han possessed some incredible treasure. He had expended far too many trump cards, so it would have been impossible for him to suppress Ling Han. He hadn't spared Ling Han out of goodwill. Ling Han glanced over, and he couldn't help but feel surprised. Tang Minglong left just like that? He wasn't aware of what had happened before, so he simply thought that Tang Minglong had arrived here earlier and already mastered this sword technique. Thus, he didn't pay much heed to this. If others didn't provoke him, he naturally wouldn't provoke them, either. Ling Han returned his attention to the stone tablet. Shio, shio, shio! Bursts of sword light slashed over again. Ling Han humphed as he extended his right hand, and counterattacked with the regulation of slaughter. Pun 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 pun! This was a fierce exchange, and Ling Han continued to slide back. However, he only retreated 7 steps in total before stabilizing himself. He then launched a ferocious counterattack as he pushed forward with determination. He could already resist the full might of the heaven-destroying 9 swords. At the very least, he could resist the might of these 4 words. This sword technique was incredibly powerful, and it was more so created on the foundation of the regulation of slaughter. Ling Han was delighted upon discovering this. This was because he already had a solid grasp of the regulation of slaughter, and he had also obtained the true meaning of the great Tao just then. In the future, he could definitely obtain a comprehensive grasp of the regulation of slaughter. Combined with the heaven-destroying 9 swords, he could definitely unleash the full might of the regulation of slaughter. Moreover, just the words, heaven-destroying 9 swords, alone could already allow Ling Han to taste a powerful sword intent, as well as a certain influence from the regulation of slaughter. He had a feeling that he could also unleash such a sword technique. Enlightenment instantly arose in his mind. The words on this stone tablet were not for one to comprehend. Instead, these words would directly transform into attacks to battle against those who arrived before them. In this way, one could comprehend the heaven-destroying 9 swords through actual battle. If one wasn't strong enough, they would end up being trapped in the outer regions. If that were the case, they could only settle for comprehending the words, heaven-destroying 9 swords. Interesting. Then let's test out how powerful the following sword technique is. Ling Han stepped forward. This time, the second row of symbols of the stone tablet lit up. Shio, shio, shio. These symbols transformed into 7 swords that slashed over, and each of them was brimming with a murderous aura. It was as if they lusted for blood. Ling Han reached over to counterattack. He didn't draw on the power of the Black Tower, and he was instead relying on his own strength. Ding, 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 ding! There was a series of crisp clanking sounds. During this exchange, bursts of sword light soared into the sky, severing the clouds and seemingly aiming to shatter the heavens. Ling Han was forced to retreat again. This was only the second row of symbols, yet its might was already several times greater than that of the first. As such, he had underestimated it, and this had resulted in him being pushed back further than anticipated. Ha ha, come again! Ling Han immediately charged forward again. Boom! Flames burst from his body, and it was clear that he had already activated the power of his divine fetus. This elevated his battle prowess by a significant amount. 1. The attacking swords shuddered, and it was as if they had been enraged. They started to frenziedly slash down at Ling Han. Ling Han continued to resist. With the 9 heavens flame dancing around him, it was as if he were an indestructible god of fire. When he punched, it was as if he could combust the entire heaven and earth. His might was formidable and domineering. However, the heaven-destroying 9 swords wasn't weak either. It became locked in a ferocious battle with Ling Han. Boom! 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 This was a strange battle, and it was hard to determine who was enjoying the advantage. Only bursts of devastating light continued to soar into the sky, continuously exploding like fireworks. At the same time, symbols of the Great Tao also continued to materialize and explode, with their destructive power simply overwhelming and astonishing. After battling for almost 7 days, Ling Han finally gained the upper hand. He slowly walked forward, forcefully pushing the sword attacks back as he did so. However, when he reached some limit, the second row of symbols suddenly dimmed down. Surprisingly, however, the third row of symbols didn't light up. It was as if the stone tablet were malfunctioning. What's going on? Did the ancient battle between the celestial kings damage this stone tablet? Ling Han stroked his chin in thought. He then glanced over at Hu Niu and the others. Right now, Hu Niu and the Empress had also entered the second region, meaning that they were also facing the attacks from the second row of symbols. Hu Niu was unleashing her rock secret technique, while the Empress had summoned all 9 of her doppelgangers. Meanwhile, Yan Xianlu was still in the first region. However, he was already on the verge of entering the second region. As for Bewitching Maiden Ro, she was still far behind him. She was essentially still stuck at the starting point. A thought suddenly occurred to Ling Han. He retreated before charging forward again. Xiao, xiao, xiao. Sword attacks swept over, carrying with them a tumultuous aura of murder. Ling Han drew his divine demon sword, and activated the sword technique that he had learned just then, the first technique of the heaven-destroying 9 swords. Something's changed. Ling Han immediately made a discovery. Even though the attacking swords were still as powerful as before, it was as if their hostility toward him had decreased by a slight amount. They had become slightly gentler. Chapter 1978 The Ninth Sword is Gone? Chapter 1978 The Ninth Sword is Gone? Ling Han came to a sudden realization. This stone tablet was indeed here to pass down the heaven-destroying 9 swords. However, after passing the second region, why wasn't the third row of symbols lighting up? This was because the stone tablet was teaching him the heaven-destroying 9 swords. Thus, wasn't it natural for him to resist using the heaven-destroying 9 swords that he had just learned? Sure enough, once Ling Han started to use heaven-destroying 9 swords, even the attacks from the second row of symbols started to become more gentle. It was like a teacher guiding their disciple. No matter how fierce this teacher seemed, it was simply being strict with its own disciples. With this realization, Ling Han turned around, and said to the Empress and Hu Niu, "Resist using the heaven-destroying 9 swords that you've just learned." Both of them were smart people, and they more so held absolute trust in Ling Han. Thus, they immediately did as he said. However, this was a sword technique that they had only just learned, so how much of its might could they truly unleash? Even though the attacks from the second row were gentler now, Ling Han and the others were still pushed back further and further. Ling Han was completely unfazed. He simply unleashed the first technique of the heaven-destroying 9 swords as he also mulled over it in his mind. As he retreated, his grasp over the heaven-destroying 9 swords also became stronger and stronger. In fact, there were even times when he would retreat into the distance to enter the Black Tower, where he would ponder under the reincarnation tree for a while before coming back out. The Empress and Hu Niu also did the same. 7 days later, the 3 of them passed through the second region at almost the exact same time. Wang Wan Wang! The third row of symbols lit up, materializing into 3 sword-wielding people. Without any nonsense, they couldn't speak anyway. These three people immediately charged over and attacked. Sure enough, this was the correct method. Ling Han laughed heartily as he brandished his divine demon sword, and unleashed the heaven-destroying 9 swords. Clang, clang, clang! Swords clashed, releasing a crisp clanging sound even though Ling Han was clearly fighting against a projection. This was a clash of the great Tao, a clash which could shake both heaven and earth. This was a ferocious battle. Like before, Ling Han and the others would fight for a while before stopping for a while. Occasionally, they would also enter the Black Tower to further comprehend the sword techniques. One day in the outside world was equivalent to 100 days of deep thought under the reincarnation tree. Coupled with their smarts, their progress was naturally shooting forward in leaps and bounds. When they reached the 5th region, Yan Xianlu had only just entered the 2nd region. Meanwhile, Bewitching Maiden Ro was still stuck in her original spot, unable to advance a single inch. This was the gulf between them. Ling Han would occasionally glance back to check on her progress, and he couldn't help but sigh in his mind. Bewitching Maiden Ro had initially been a king tier. After obtaining the help of the heavenly Tao Jade, she had mended her path of cultivation and advanced to become an emperor tier. Moreover, she had become a top-notch emperor tier. Yet, even top-notch emperor tiers surprisingly didn't have the right to learn the heaven-destroying 9 swords. At most, they could only learn the first technique. The celestial king who created this sword technique had definitely been an extremely proud being. In his mind, only monarch tiers had the right to inherit his sword technique. As for other Alsorans, he would rather this sword technique be lost than be inherited by them. Moreover, this was definitely a high-level celestial king. 7th heaven? 8th heaven? 9th heaven? Ling Han became increasingly astonished. He had already come across several reincarnations of celestial kings. In other words, there was a significant chance that many celestial kings would still die. This was completely different from his expectation of the celestial realm. In his mind, celestial kings should have been eternal and indestructible. He forcefully suppressed the puzzlement in his mind. Right now, his most important task was to master this sword technique. In any case, his questions would eventually be answered following his advance in cultivation level. As he pushed forward, the projections summoned by the stone tablet became increasingly powerful. In turn, it also became increasingly difficult to master the heaven-destroying 9 swords. During his 3rd year here, Ling Han suddenly stopped to glance back. Someone else had come. It was Xu Yering and the others. They had finally finished analyzing the paths, and found the correct route to reach this place. However, it was a shame that just a few forks in the path had delayed them by over 2 years. The gulf between them and Ling Han was far too large. This was also a direct reflection of the reincarnation tree's incredible usefulness. This was the impressive nature of the source powers of heaven and earth. Upon seeing Ling Han, expressions of anger spread across Xu Yering's and the others' faces. If they had followed Ling Han, they could have arrived here over 2 years ago. Would they have needed to waste so much time? Ling Han only needed to lead the way. Would that bring him any loss? Was there any need for him to be so petty? They were merely considering this problem from their own point of view. As a result, they started to feel aggrieved and wronged. However, why didn't they consider this from Ling Han's point of view? Why did he need to bring them here? Not to mention that they were fighting for treasures in a mystery realm, they would at least need to thank him for pointing out the correct path even in the outside world, right? Ling Han simply replied with a smile. He had no time for these people. Anyhow, Xu Yering and the others naturally noticed the stone tablet as well. They hurriedly walked over to start battling with the heaven-destroying 9 swords. However, it was a shame that only Xu Yering had obtained the true meaning of the great Tao pertaining to the regulation of slaughter among them. Thus, how could they possibly hope to learn the heaven-destroying 9 swords through simple battle? Of course, this was unless they possessed heaven-defying talent and aptitude. Otherwise, it was simply impossible for them to learn the heaven-destroying 9 swords. Even so, they were still unwilling to give up. After all, this was a paramount sword technique, so how could they abandon it just like that? Thus, they continued to persist with their futile struggle. Ling Han turned his attention back to the battle at hand. Even though the humanoid projections looked ferocious, they were actually very good teachers. Time and time again, they continued to fully exhibit the complete essence of the heaven-destroying 9 swords. Another year passed, and even bewitching maiden Rose saw a significant improvement, finally advancing to the 2nd region. However, apart from Xu Yaring, the rest of the newcomers all remained stuck in the 1st region. Living up to her name as the 2nd greatest prodigy of the wide prosperity heaven and her status as the reincarnation of a celestial king, Xu Yaring had already advanced to the 3rd region, rivaling the progress of Yan Xianlu. At this time, however, Ling Han, the Empress, and Hu Niu had already been battling in the 8th region for a very long time. Once they passed this region, they would be able to learn the final technique of the heaven-destroying 9 swords. Boom! Ling Han was the first to enter the 9th region. As he swung his divine demon sword, a humanoid projection was viciously obliterated from existence. A boundless murderous aura emanated from his body, and with a confident stride, he finally entered the 9th region. However, the 9th row of symbols didn't light up. What's going on? Ling Han was slightly surprised. He had clearly arrived here by using the heaven-destroying 9 swords, so why was there no reaction from the stone tablet? He observed the stone tablet carefully, and he finally discovered that the 9th row of symbols was incomplete. It was damaged by someone? He glanced over it again, and he immediately shook his head. The stone tablet hadn't been damaged by anyone. Instead, it was incomplete in the first place. Perhaps the Celestial King hadn't been able to create the 9th technique. Or perhaps he had suddenly changed his mind while carving the symbols for the 9th technique. Without the willpower of a Celestial King, the 9th row of symbols was dull and lifeless. Moreover, it looked like a jumble of meaningless scribbles. Ling Han had no option but to stop. It was also at this moment that the stone tablet suddenly collapsed with a resounding boom. It was as if it were laying to eternal rest after successfully imparting its inheritance. All of the sword light and humanoid projections instantly vanished. What did you do? A monarch tear from the wide prosperity heaven roared at Ling Han. He was called Ma Lugan, and he was ranked 8th among the prodigies from the wide prosperity heaven. What did I do? Ling Han rubbed his nose. This person was clearly blaming him for the collapse of the stone tablet. Although this was likely true, it was not something of his explicit doing. Instead, it was a result of the Celestial King's decision. Once someone mastered the 8th technique, the stone tablet would automatically crumble. As such, what did this have to do with him? Not to mention that he didn't know about this. Even if he did, was there any obligation for him to stop? Did he need to wait for them to learn the heaven-destroying 9 swords? What an absolute joke. Don't blame me for demeaning you, but you trash couldn't have mastered this sword technique anyway, Ling Han said in a serious voice. Chapter 1979 Killing the Chicken to Warn the Monkeys. Chapter 1979 Killing the Chicken to Warn the Monkeys. Ling Han truly wasn't deprecating them. Rather, without learning the true meaning of the regulation of slaughter, it was genuinely impossible for these people to learn the heaven-destroying 9 swords. They would merely be wasting their time. This had nothing to do with talent. Of course, this was unless one possessed heaven-defying talent. You! The prodigies from the wide prosperity heaven were enraged upon hearing this. Not only had Ling Han destroyed the stone tablet and prevented them from learning the sword technique, but he was even calling them trash. Ling Han smiled and said, "What? You're not resigned to this? Then come, see how I pummel you people." The prodigies from the wide prosperity heaven faltered upon hearing this. They then looked toward Xu Yaring. Of everyone present, only Xu Yaring could rival Ling Han. However, Xu Yaring remained silent. After all, Wuming had already said that he would personally take Ling Han's life. Thus, let alone targeting Ling Han, she might even help him if he were facing a life-threatening situation. A wide grin spread across Ling Han's face. He wouldn't be afraid even if Xu Yaring truly targeted him. During their battle with Wuming, he had already observed her battle prowess clearly. At most, she was only as powerful as him. Of course, this was ignoring any trump cards that she might have. He swept his gaze over Ma Lugang and the others and said, "As men, it's best for you not to rely on a woman. If you have balls, then come at me." Ma Lugang jumped forward and said, "Do you really think you're invincible?" He knew that he was no match for Ling Han. However, exchanging 10 or 100 blows with him shouldn't be any problem at all. Thus, he decided to exchange a few blows with Ling Han. After winning some face back, he would then retreat and leave. Ling Han immediately shot forward. Whoosh! Like a bolt of lightning, he instantly appeared before Ma Lugang. He then reached over to grab at his face. "Impudence!" Ma Lugang roared. He replied with a palm strike of his own. "You're indeed stronger than me. However, you still can't underestimate me like this." A smile of ridicule tugged at the corners of Ling Han's lips. Drawing on the power of the Black Tower, he immediately activated the power of time. Ma Lugang's movements instantly slowed down. Time was flowing at a slower pace. With Ling Han's current power, he simply needed to decrease Ma Lugang's speed by a limited amount. Reaching over, he easily grabbed onto Ma Lugang's face and directly lifted him up. He faced no resistance at all. Fuck! A cold chill ran down the spines of the prodigies from the wide prosperity heaven. Ma Lugang was the 8th-ranked monarch tier of the wide prosperity heaven. Even though he was no match for the top 3 freaks, was ranking inside the top 10 not freakish enough already? Yet, he couldn't even withstand a single strike from Ling Han. Had Ling Han been this powerful before? Ling Han was naturally using this opportunity to assert his might and dominance. Otherwise, it would be beneath him to draw on the power of the Black Tower to target a weakling. MMPH. Ma Lugang started to thrash about, yet this was in absolute vain. His face was filled with fury and embarrassment. As a mighty monarch tier, he had actually been captured in a single exchange. This made him look like a complete fool for what he had said before. This was utterly humiliating. "If you're so weak, then obediently stand aside. Don't charge into your own death," Ling Han said in a baleful voice. He was radiating with ice-cold killing intent. "Ling Han, release him!" Xu Yaring chided. She wouldn't attack Ling Han, but this didn't mean that she would remain indifferent to him killing prodigies from the wide prosperity heaven. Ling Han glanced at her, and said in a calm voice, "Do I know you? Don't test my patience." Xu Yaring replied with an ice-cold expression. Crack! With a tightening of his grip, Ling Han instantly snapped Ma Lugang's neck. Ma Lugang shuddered for a moment before falling completely limp. So what if he was a monarch tier? He only had one life. "You!" Xu Yaring was wild with rage. Boom! Her silky black hair started to billow even though there was no wind. She was burning with flames of fury. Ling Han clasped his hands behind his back and said, "You what? Do I owe you anything? Don't command me to do this and that. I can do whatever I want." Xu Yaring clenched her hands into fists. If she'd still possessed the power of celestial kings, she would have instantly captured Ling Han. At that time, she would have complete authority over his life. Now, however, there was nothing she could do. "Leave!" She gritted her teeth and growled. The stone tablet had already been destroyed, so there was no point staying on this second mountain peak any longer. A feeling of grief and sorrow welled up in the hearts of the prodigies from the wide prosperity heaven. As they looked at Ling Han taking the spatial god tools from Ma Lugang's body, they were completely powerless to stop him. They could only turn around and leave. Boom! A ball of 9 heavens flame burst forth from Ling Han's hands, incinerating Ma Lugang's corpse. With Ma Lugang's death, the animosity between them also vanished. Thus, Ling Han would allow him to peacefully return to the embrace of heaven and earth. Hu Niu leaped onto Ling Han and said, "Bad Ling Han! Niu was only a step away from mastering the 8th technique." Ling Han chuckled and said, "No worries. I'll teach you guys in the future." The stone tablet had indeed disappeared. However, he had already obtained the full inheritance of the 8 sword techniques. After reaching a certain height, Perhaps he could even create the 9th technique by himself. I definitely can, Ling Han said in his mind. He had obtained the true meaning of the regulation of slaughter, and he had also learned the first 8 techniques of the heaven-destroying 9 swords. Thus, as long as he completely mastered these, creating the 9th sword technique would only be a matter of time. Brother Ling, I'm also relying on you, Yan Xianlu said shamelessly. The heaven-destroying 9 swords was incredibly powerful. After all, this was a technique that was built on the foundation of the regulation of slaughter. Before reaching the level of Celestial King, this technique was even stronger than those of the 5 elements, and the regulation of lightning. Ling Han chuckled in reply. He didn't agree or disagree. If he had time, he wouldn't mind teaching Yan Xianlu. However, he was an extremely busy person, so it was impossible for him to remain in a single place for an extended amount of time. Thus, he didn't dare to make any promises. Fortunately, Yan Xianlu was only saying this in passing. Each person had their own opportunities and destiny, so this wasn't something that could be obtained by force. They started to descend the mountain. Ascending the mountain had been extremely difficult, yet descending it was as easy as could be. They could all remember the path that they had taken to get here, so descending was naturally a piece of cake. They headed toward the 3rd mountain peak. To their astonishment, the 3rd peak was incredibly easy to ascend. There was no powerful gravitational force, nor was there any maze to navigate. There was no monster to block their path, either. Thus, it only took them 7 days to reach the peak of this mountain. In reality, however, they hadn't reached the true peak of the mountain. This was because the mountain peak was cut off midway. Even so, it was still unbelievably tall. In any case, it was no wonder that there hadn't been any obstructions or difficulties. As it turned out, this mountain peak had already been annihilated. It was most likely damaged during the battle between the Celestial Kings. How astonishing! I truly wonder how astounding that battle was. I truly want to witness a battle between Celestial Kings. They all sighed with emotion before turning around to leave. Right now, there was only a single thing left for them to find the fiery flame lightning strike wood, a source power of heaven and earth. However, this valley was so incredibly large, so how would they find it? Then, let's just casually stroll around, Ling Han said. The Empress, Hun Yo, and bewitching maiden Ro naturally wouldn't oppose this. Meanwhile, Yan Xianlu decided to split paths with them. First of all, he didn't want to interrupt Ling Han and his family. Second of all, they were looking for the fiery flame lightning strike wood, and this was completely up to each person's luck. This wasn't determined by strength. One of the annoying people has finally left. However, the other one is still here, Hun Yo said as she looked at bewitching maiden Ro. However, bewitching maiden Ro was extremely thick-skinned, and she didn't pay any heed to this. This caused Hun Yo's eyes to glint with anger again. The 4 of them started to casually stroll around. In this colossal valley, they truly didn't know where to go. Perhaps they might have to wait here for several hundred years, or even several thousand years. Fortunately, the 3 Blooms Valley had no limit on how long they could remain. There was no rule that they had to leave after a certain number of years, or risk facing a fatal punishment. This allowed them to stroll around at a leisurely pace. However, for a source power of heaven and earth, this was completely worth it. The valley was crawling with monsters that were filled with spikes. However, to Ling Han and the others, these monsters weren't an annoyance. Instead, they were a source of treasures. They possessed Celestial King bloodstones that contained the regulation of slaughter, and these were treasures that were as valuable as a city. In the blink of an eye, 7 years had already passed. Ling Han and the others hadn't wasted this time, and they had instead used it to strengthen their grasp of the regulation of slaughter and the heaven-destroying 9 swords. Crack! A bolt of lightning suddenly descended from the sky, giving Ling Han and the others a fright. Chapter 1980 Fiery Flame Lightning Strike Wood. Chapter 1980 Fiery Flame Lightning Strike Wood. This bolt of lightning had descended far too suddenly. Moreover, its might was overwhelming, and just its aura alone was enough to chill one to the core. At the very least, Ling Han was certain that he would have been killed if he had been struck by this lightning. "This is heavenly tribulation!" Ling Han exclaimed. Even though this bolt of lightning had descended from above them, it had eerily avoided them in a mysterious manner. There could only be a single reason. This was heavenly tribulation, and it would only target a certain individual. Thus, as long as others didn't interfere, it wouldn't attack them regardless of how close they were to the target. Of course, if heavenly tribulation sent shards of rocks flying everywhere, the heavens naturally wouldn't take responsibility for those who were wounded by these rocks. However, none of them had ascended to the next level, so why was heavenly tribulation suddenly descending? Moreover, it was such a devastating heavenly tribulation. "Fiery flame lightning strike would!" they exclaimed in unison. Only this wondrous matter would attract tribulation after tribulation. If it weren't being blazed by flames, it would be suffering the wrath of lightning. Thus, this sudden and unexpected heavenly tribulation could only point to a single thing. It was almost certain that the fiery flame lightning strike would have been struck by lightning again. Just then, they had only witnessed a sliver of the shock wave. If that's the case, they looked up, only to see a vast expanse of clouds and mists. Ling Han took a deep breath and gathered all of his strength. He then drew his divine demon sword, and unleashed a slash at the sky. Boom! A burst of sword light arced through the sky, brimming with a tumultuous and murderous aura. The clouds and mists were violently ripped apart, revealing an expanse of clear blue sky. As if they possessed life, however, the clouds and mists started to rapidly squirm and fuse, causing the sky to become gray and hazy again. However, that short instant was already enough for Ling Han and the others to see clearly. There was an indescribably colossal tree in the sky, and they were currently standing under the crown of this tree. No wonder an arc of lightning had crashed down. As it turned out, they were standing right under the fiery flame lightning strike wood. This was truly a case of looking for light under a lamp's shadow. They had been searching for the fiery flame lightning strike wood right under its shade. "Judging by the shape of the tree's crown, the main trunk should be over there," Ling Han said as he pointed in a certain direction. Let's go." The four of them set off in that direction. Surprisingly, it took them 7 entire days to finally arrive before a pitch-black wall. Standing before this wall, one would realize that this wall wasn't entirely straight. Instead, there was a slight curve to it. More precisely, this was a circular wall. However, it was far too large, so from close up it looked much like a flat wall. This was the fiery flame lightning strike wood. When they finally discovered that they were standing under the crown of the tree, perhaps they had already been traveling under it for several days. Yet they had still needed to spend another 7 days to finally reach the base of its trunk. This was a direct reflection of the colossal nature of this tree. With the trunk of the tree being so colossal, could the crown of the tree be small? Ling Han reached over to place his hand on the tree trunk. Crackle! An arc of white lightning immediately shot over. Pun! Ling Han was sent flying back. Hunyo hurriedly ran over and asked, "Ling Han, are you okay?" "I'm fine," Ling Han replied as he picked himself up. Even though he said this, his entire body was still trembling. The arcs of lightning on this fiery flame lightning strike wood couldn't be underestimated. Even though they weren't powerful enough to kill him, they could still cause him to tremble uncontrollably, and make him feel extremely uncomfortable. "Come, everyone, give it a try. Let's see who can obtain this source power of heaven and earth," Ling Han said. Ling Han wanted to obtain this fiery flame lightning strike wood, yet he definitely wouldn't be greedy about it. He would give others a chance to try their luck. In any case, source powers of heaven and earth could only be obtained by those fated to it. The Empress and the others all nodded in reply. They distanced themselves from each other before facing the fiery flame lightning strike wood. Regarding how to obtain this treasure, this was completely up to each individual. Moreover, this was an extremely rare opportunity. After all, who knew when this fiery flame lightning strike wood might soar through the sky and tunnel through the earth to leave? Ling Han also walked over, channeling the indestructible heaven scroll as he did so. Since this was a heavenly venerable tear cultivation technique, one which was transcendent above all Tao, it would theoretically be very attractive to source powers of heaven and earth. 1. All four of them lit up with a brilliant glow. Symbols of the great Tao started to materialize on their bodies, yearning to achieve resonance with the fiery flame lightning strike would so that they could receive its acknowledgement. However, the fiery flame lightning strike would remain completely unresponsive. It was much like an ordinary tree, to which any expression and effort from them would be futile. However, Ling Han and the others didn't give up. As long as the fiery flame lightning strike would remain here, they would still have a chance. In any case, how could a source power of heaven and earth be so easy to obtain? They continued to try. Several days passed, and a dense pattern of veins surprisingly started to glow on the tree. There's a reaction. Ling Han and the others were delighted. They started to hurriedly pour more effort into their attempts. Xiao! A streak of light suddenly slashed over from behind them. Ling Han humped before jumping up and replying with a fist. Pun! The streak of light instantly shattered into pieces. However, the vein patterns on the fiery flame lightning strike would also stop glowing. At the same time, the tree and earth also shuddered slightly, and it was as if the tree were about to uproot itself and fly away. Ling Han was infuriated upon seeing this. He looked over, only to see 6 people standing there. It was Shu Yaring and the prodigies from the wide prosperity heaven. They were truly like evil spirits that followed him around. Moreover, Ling Han's efforts had also been rendered futile by them. Not only that, but the fiery flame lightning strike would had even shown signs of fleeing. Ling Han wasn't opposed to competition. However, he sorely detested this kind of toxic competition. Not long ago, he had already killed Ma Lugang in a fit of rage. Now these people were directly trampling on his bottom line. You're seeking death! Ling Han charged over in rage. Since they dared to interfere, they were naturally prepared to accept his wrath. Boom! Wings of flames unfurled behind Ling Han, and with a flap, he already arrived before Shu Yaring and the others. He drew his divine demon sword, and immediately unleashed the heaven-destroying 9 swords. Whoosh! Bursts of sword light blazed into the surroundings. Shu Yaring humphed as she replied with a palm strike. The others also unleashed their attacks. With Shu Yaring keeping Ling Han occupied, they could wantonly attack to their heart's content. So that's how you want it? Ling Han said with a cold chuckle. He activated his fire element divine fetus, immediately summoning a column of light from the sky. This column of light enveloped him, and it was impossible to describe the might that was radiating from this light. Damn it! Hurry up and retreat! Shu Yaring yelled in a frantic voice. She immediately shot back in retreat. Can you truly flee? Ling Han asked in a cold voice. He unleashed the full power of his divine fetus. Boom! With him as the center, a wave of flames swept into the surroundings. Like a roaring fire dragon, these flames instantly caught up to Shu Yaring and the others. This was the most powerful attack of his divine fetus. Even though Ling Han could only unleash one such attack in a short period of time, the might of this attack was truly astonishing. The wave of flames gradually died down, revealing Ling Han's figure. His hands were clasped behind his back, and only a single person remained standing before him. It was naturally Shu Yaring. However, she was also in a sorry state, and much of her clothing was already destroyed and in tatters, revealing much of her snow-white skin. In fact, one could even see glimpses of her behind, waist, and chest. However, numerous symbols flashed across her skin, and these symbols covered her body as if they were clothes. She was panting in exertion, and a lot of her silky black hair had already been singed. She no longer wore an expression of nobility and calm, and she instead appeared as disheveled as could be. As for the other 5 prodigies, they had all been exterminated. Shu Yaring threw her head back and roared at the sky. Her beautiful face was filled with wild rage. The wide prosperity heaven had initially been brimming with prodigies. However, many of them had been engulfed by Wuming, and now more of them had been killed by Ling Han. Almost all of them were now dead. This caused her to feel wild with rage. This was a calamity for the wide prosperity heaven, and it would definitely take them countless years to recover this vitality. Naive Junior, you're actually showing such wanton disregard for the bigger picture, Shu Yering said in a baleful voice. In her eyes, everything was for the sake of fighting against the storm of darkness. Thus, none of the top-notch prodigies could die. In fact, it would be best if they could all grow to become ninth heaven celestial kings. By slaughtering these prodigies, Ling Han was essentially slaughtering the future of the celestial realm. This caused Shu Yering to boil with killing intent. Chapter 1981 Retreat. Chapter 1981 Retreat. Ling Han's expression was calm, and he said, "You can provoke me, but I'm not allowed to counterattack? Don't be such a hypocrite. If you want to battle, then come at me." Shu Yering howled in fury as she charged over. She retrieved an ancient-looking mirror and pointed it at Ling Han, upon which a figure immediately crawled out from the mirror. Astonishingly, this figure was a mirror image of Ling Han. In fact, even its aura was exactly the same as Ling Han's. "Die!" the figure roared as it charged at Ling Han. Boom! Ling Han exchanged a punch with this figure, and he was instantly sent stumbling back. Only after retreating 17 steps did he finally come to a stop. They were evenly matched, with neither being stronger than the other. An expression of astonishment spread across Ling Han's face. This figure looked exactly the same as him, and it was also just as powerful as him. Sure enough, reincarnated celestial kings had all kinds of powerful techniques. With a long cry, Shu Yering immediately lunged at Ling Han. The figure that she had summoned also lunged toward Ling Han. At this moment, Ling Han was facing the combined attacks of two incredibly powerful elites. He was instantly plunged into a perilous situation. "I refuse to believe that a measly treasure can replicate my full power," Ling Han said as he summoned his divine demon's sword. He wanted to see if the figure could also summon a divine demon's sword. Sure enough, the figure didn't draw a sword. However, it continued to replicate Ling Han's actions, using its fingers like a sword instead. It slashed its fingers down at Ling Han. Pun! 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 Ling Han exchanged blows with his two powerful opponents. He didn't need to say much about Shu Yering's strength. She was the second most powerful prodigy of the wide prosperity heaven, and in her previous life, she had more so been a seventh heaven celestial king. Thus, she was naturally very powerful. Meanwhile, the figure that she had summoned possessed a strength that could rival his. It was as if heaven and earth had made a carbon copy of him. There was only a slight difference in the techniques that it used. In any case, they were a formidable duo who possessed overwhelming might. If their opponent were someone like Yan Xianlu, they could most likely obliterate them in a single strike. However, Ling Han's physique was far too powerful. Even though the attacks of his opponents had already reached the peak stage of the Yin Soul, even showing signs of reaching the Earth Soul, they could only draw a small amount of blood upon striking him. These attacks couldn't even break his bones, much less wound him. Ling Han roared with laughter and shouted, "Come battle! Come battle!" He was filled with fighting spirit, and he was completely unafraid even though he was outnumbered. He was brimming with confidence. Ling Han unleashed the heaven-destroying 9 swords. If the figure could replicate even this sword technique, then it would be far too astonishing. After all, that would mean that Shu Yering could easily obtain the heaven-destroying 9 swords from this figure. The figure instantly unleashed a sword technique. However, this wasn't the heaven-destroying 9 swords. Even so, the might of this sword technique couldn't be underestimated. Ling Han chuckled upon seeing this. Sure enough, this was only a treasured tool. Even though it was extraordinary, it was only able to replicate his aura and movements. It couldn't replicate his mind and techniques. He drew on the power of the Black Tower. Boom! Activating the regulation of slaughter and unleashing the heaven-destroying 9 swords, Ling Han ferociously slashed down at Shu Yering. With the power of the Black Tower, the might of this slash was naturally unfathomable. Right now, the greatest power of the Black Tower was to stop time. If this ability could affect celestial kings, then Ling Han might even be able to slay celestial kings. Of course, even if this power was genuinely effective against celestial kings, it might only be effective for an infinitesimally short amount of time, so short that even ascending origin tier elites wouldn't notice it. Following this power to stop time, the regulation of slaughter and the regulation of space were also incredibly powerful. Most importantly, the regulation of slaughter shared a common origin with the heaven-destroying 9 swords. Thus, the might of this sword technique was buffed by a considerable amount. Swoosh! It was as if this slash could obliterate heaven and earth. Shu Yaring's expression involuntarily changed. The might of this slash instilled a sense of apprehension within her. She unleashed her full power to battle with Ling Han. Boom! 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 The 2 top-notch monarch tiers became locked in a ferocious battle. At this moment, either of them could seize the upper hand. However, Ling Han was confident that if this continued, he would become the eventual victor. This was because his physique was far too powerful. He was already enjoying an indomitable position. Shu Yaring also noticed this. During this intense battle, she continued to suffer wound after wound. Meanwhile, even though Ling Han was also struck by her and the figure that she had summoned, he suffered almost no wounds at all. Even if he did, those were nothing but a mere scratch. Even though Shu Yaring was nowhere near losing her battle prowess, she was acutely aware that she would definitely end up in dire straits if this continued. Perhaps that would be in half a year, or perhaps that would be in 5 or 6 years. She gritted her teeth before suddenly turning around to leave. She abandoned this meaningless battle. She would kill Ling Han after advancing to the dividing soul tier. She was confident that she could do so. This was because she had been a celestial king in her previous life. Thus, she would immediately be able to wield an astonishing battle prowess upon advancing to the dividing soul tier. She would be far superior to ordinary dividing soul tier elites. She would let this person live for a few more days. She was extremely resolute, and she left with no hesitation at all. Did she not want the fiery flame lightning strike wood anymore? No, she naturally still wanted it. However, she didn't have to obtain it here. This tree was colossal, so where couldn't she obtain the fiery flame lightning strike wood from? Just then, she had arrived here by pure coincidence. However, she had also interrupted Ling Han and the others. Otherwise, the fiery flame lightning strike wood might have already been obtained by Ling Han. Ling Han pursued her for a few steps before giving up. His defenses were definitely invincible and unrivaled among those at the same cultivation level. In terms of battle prowess, however, the same was not necessarily the case. This was especially the case for speed. Shu Yaring had been a celestial king in her previous life, so she possessed a terrifying amount of celestial techniques. At the very least, she was extremely skilled in fleeing. In fact, this made a lot of sense. Becoming a celestial king wasn't easy, and thus the most important thing was definitely to protect oneself. Thus, it was understandable that they would spend a lot of time and effort on movement techniques. Come, let's continue, Ling Han said with a smile. Bewitching Maiden Rose's eyes were filled with adoration and reverence. This man was far too extraordinary. In the beginning, he had only been an outstanding king tier. However, in a short period of time, he had already grown to become an invincible emperor tier. Even Yen Xianla, widely acknowledged to be the #1 prodigy in the calm peace heaven, had been overshadowed by him. Now, Ling Han was even more impressive. Even the second-ranked prodigy from the wide prosperity heaven had been defeated by him. This kind of man, one who was so nice to her as well. Just what kind of divine treasure was the heavenly Tao Jade? This treasure had forcefully raised her from the level of king tier to the level of emperor tier. Who else in the world was so generous? Woman, don't you dare have any indecent thoughts. Ling Han is Niu's. Hu Niu said through gritted teeth. Why were these women so shameless? She had only left for a short few years, yet they had already seized the opportunity to attach themselves to Ling Han. Detestable, truly detestable. Let's continue, Ling Han said. He was well aware that Shu Yaring wouldn't give up so easily. She was definitely trying to obtain the fiery flame lightning strike wood from some other location. Moreover, she had a great chance of succeeding. This was because she was a reincarnated celestial king. As such, her essence was no weaker than that of the fiery flame lightning strike would. In fact, it might even be stronger. Thus, they definitely couldn't let their guard down, and they had to obtain the fiery flame lightning strike wood as soon as possible. As long as they didn't obtain this treasure, they couldn't let their guard down. The four of them sat down again. They channeled their cultivation techniques, and they fully unleashed their power, attempting to attract the fiery flame lightning strike wood. The days flowed by. This time, however, the fiery flame lightning strike would remain completely unresponsive. After being allured once, it was as if its standards had grown even higher. It wouldn't be attracted easily. Ling Han and the others didn't give up. Since they had already succeeded once, they naturally couldn't give up at such a critical time. 10 days, 1 month, 3 months. Time flew by. When they approached 100 days, a dense pattern of glowing veins finally appeared on the fiery flame lightning strike wood again. Who had attracted it? Chapter 1982 Collecting the Ancestral Tree. Chapter 1982 Collecting the Ancestral Tree. Celestial light entwined Ling Han and his group all around. They were all divine fetuses, but were of different attributes. Furthermore, they were all extremely powerful, and under the full power boost, their power of divine fetus was completely released to attract this source power of heaven and earth. To gain the recognition of a source power of heaven and earth, it had to be celestial king tier, at the very least. Divine fetus was the awakening of a celestial king tier bloodline. Only Ling Han was different. Though he was also stimulating the power of divine fetus, his true trump card was still the indestructible heaven scroll. This was a heavenly venerable tier level cultivation technique, ranking above celestial king tier. The patterns on the fiery flame lightning strike would become brighter and brighter, and streaks of celestial light entwined around it, causing the whole tree to become incredibly magnificent, and making it appear in the midst of this foggy area. Who exactly was drawing on the ancestral tree? Wuming, the fiery flame lightning strike wood trembled lightly, and the tree's trunk suddenly began to shrink. At first, it was at a very slow rate, but only after a short while, the speed became extremely fast, and it was practically visible that this massive ancestral tree was shrinking, and shrinking. It went from its initial colossal size that was so huge that the whole tree could not be taken in with a single look to becoming clearly within sight, and then turning into a small sapling. Turning from a tree into a sapling, what did this mean? The ancestral tree had already made its decision, planning to recognize someone as its master. Who was it? Xiao, the fiery flame lightning strike wood suddenly uprooted itself from the ground. It was but 3 inches tall, yet was incredibly crystalline. Every single tree leaf bore fiery flames and lightning, a sight to behold. What caused the expressions of Ling Han and the others to change drastically was that the fiery flame lightning strike wood was actually flying slowly in a direction away from them. Was it Shu Yering? This woman indeed could not be underestimated. Now that she was given the chance to make her move, it actually drew on the ancestral tree of heaven and earth. However, it was clear that the fiery flame lightning strike wood was still hesitating. Otherwise, it would have directly streaked through the air towards Shu Yering instead of wavering and hesitating here. There was still hope. In fact, this was where the true contest began. Ling Han and the others all continued to draw on the fiery flame lightning strike wood. No matter what, they were determined to kidnap it. As expected, with their active display of power, the fiery flame lightning strike wood soon stopped, and then flew over in the direction of Ling Han and his group. Come on, come on! But the good fortune did not last. Only after a while, the fiery flame lightning strike wood stopped again, and then flew on a wavering course in a direction opposite of them. Clearly, Shu Yering had also discovered something was off, and had increased the effort of seduction. As expected of a previous celestial king, someone capable of standing against the 4 of them all on her own. Ling Han relaxed his spirit. Boom, the intent realm of the indestructible heaven scroll was completely released, turning into an ocean that wrapped entirely around the fiery flame lightning strike wood. The fiery flame lightning strike would trembled strongly, and then flew towards Ling Han in a flash. When it arrived in front of him, this ancestral tree turned into a shooting star that sank into Ling Han's forehead. Then, the seal of a tree sapling appeared on his head, but it immediately faded out. The contest had finally come to an end, and Ling Han was the ultimate victor. It could not be helped. The indestructible heaven scroll was too strong. This was a heavenly Venerate tier-level cultivation technique, and it was rare to find one that could match it in terms of quality. If it were not for the fact that Xu Yaring had once been a celestial king, and had countless methods, as well as something the likes of the brand of a celestial king, it would have been completely impossible for her to engage in a tug-of-war with Ling Han. She would not even have the chance to interfere. A furious roar of indignant anger rang out from afar. It was Xu Yaring. She had initially thought that she could obtain the fiery flame lightning strike wood, yet all her efforts had come to nothing. She did indeed have a reason for feeling unreconciled. That was because if Ling Han had not been here, she would have been able to collect this ancestral tree without a doubt. Within Ling Han's dantian, the third source power of heaven and earth appeared, causing the two other strong source powers to descend into a power struggle. A fundamental change took place in the circumstances of the lightning source power watching the show from the sidelines. The ancestral tree of heaven and earth was naturally no weaker compared to the Xianyin source water and nine heavens flame, so as proper and expected, it wished to claim its own place. However, how could two great source powers be willing to easily give up some of their own territory? This naturally resulted in an inevitable power struggle. The three source powers fought intensely, and the three sides finally divided the territory into three, each claiming one side for their own. The source power of lightning found a sliver of presence in the crevices, occupying no more than 3 to 4% of the territory in his dantian, its situation all the more miserable. And this wasn't the worst of it either. As Ling Han's grasp of the regulations of slaughter, time, and space became stronger and stronger, and they gradually became source powers, the space that source power of lightning occupied would be further decreased. Ling Han stretched out his left hand, and with a mental command, that seal of a young sapling immediately appeared on his forehead. Then, a strange power surged, and streaks of green light entwined around his hand, endless vitality spreading out. This was the source power that the fiery flame lightning strike would had manifested, bestowing on him a strong recovery ability. Though this ancestral tree was constantly being struck by lightning and burnt by fire, it was also precisely because of that it still did not die. So how exuberant was its vitality. Not only could it heal his own injuries, it could also be used on others. Ling Han also had further enlightenment that this was not only effective on its own, but could also refer to the indestructible heaven scroll, and further improve his self-recovery ability. The indestructible heaven scroll was also ultimately created from referring to the cultivation techniques of various immortal beasts, and further fused with the comprehension of a heavenly Venerate. Thus, the source power of heaven and earth was naturally able to increase its might. This heaven scroll was more inclined towards defense and recovery. Thus, the source power of wood that he had obtained now was able to lead to unexpected effects. If Ling Han could gain the source power of earth in future, then it definitely would be able to improve his defenses as well. Ling Han, you are so awesome! You are only a fifth severance, but you already have 3 source powers of heaven and earth! Hunyo exclaimed in excitement, not the slightest bit despondent because she herself had not obtained the source power of heaven and earth. On the side, the Empress was also smiling gracefully, feeling happy for Ling Han. If it had been the Empress or Hunyo who had obtained this source power of heaven and earth, then Ling Han would also have been happy for them, and not felt the slightest bit of envy. They were a family. Of course, it was a different story whether Hunyo and the Empress would have felt happy if it had been either of them that had succeeded. It probably would have been very unlikely. Though bewitching Maiden Ro felt that it was a bit of a pity, she astonishingly discovered that she actually did not feel much jealousy, either, causing her to internally sigh. She probably had truly fallen in love with this quarrelsome guy. Otherwise, she would have felt some jealousy, right? We can finally go back. The moment this thought came to being, they felt an incredible longing, and began to rush outside the valley. Though they had taken more than 80 years to reach this place, the majority of their time had been spent on comprehending the true meaning of the Great Tao and the heaven-destroying 9 swords. Thus, when it came time for them to leave, it was naturally much shorter. In a mere 3 months' time, they had already arrived in the proximity of the valley entrance. So many prodigies have died this time round, and when the news spreads out, it will probably cause huge waves, Ling Han said ruefully. First, Wuming had eliminated a great number of them, and then Ling Han himself had killed 6 of them. By now, there were probably just 5 or 6 left of the monarch tiers of the wide prosperity heaven, not much more than the calm peace heavens. Furthermore, one still had to take into consideration that there were a good number of reincarnations of celestial kings among the monarch tiers of the wide prosperity heaven. There were actually pitifully few prodigies that had depended on their own efforts to reach the monarch tier. With such a massive blow, it was unknown how many years the wide prosperity heaven would have to take to fully recover. Chapter 1983 Great Improvement in Art of Alchemy. Chapter 1983 Great Improvement in Art of Alchemy. There was no celestial king standing by at the valley entrance. There were wide implications involved in this journey through the mystery realm, and there were a good number of descendants of even 8th heaven celestial king that had entered into this space, such as Yun Xianlu. Thus, not one celestial king had come here, all seeming to be certain their own heirs would have enough ability to protect themselves. That was the truth as well. Every single monarch tier and emperor tier had a life-saving secret technique bestowed by a celestial king. Unfortunately, they had encountered a maniac called Wuming. They did not even manage to use such techniques, and had simply died directly. This was also a test from the celestial kings for their heirs. Ordinarily speaking, seeing as every single one of them had the backing of a celestial king, even if they were no match for their opponent, it was extremely rare for anyone to deal a fatal blow. Aside from Wuming. Thus, whether it was the wide prosperity heaven or calm peace heaven, both had suffered great losses, but the wide prosperity heaven was more seriously hit by the disaster. Ling Han and his group exited the valley, shook their heads, and set out on their way home. Of course, they were heading back to Alchemy City. This trip to Alchemy City was very time-consuming, and they were even less concerned about how much time they would take. They took multiple stops along the way, and would occasionally enter into seclusion inside the Black Tower. Undergoing comprehension underneath the reincarnation tree naturally had strong effects, and the time also flew by extremely fast. When they returned to Alchemy City, 10 years had already passed on the road. Ling Han and his group all had great improvement. Ling Han, the Empress, and Hunyo had all cultivated the cultivation level of 5th severance to perfection, and had also gained astonishing improvement in the regulation of slaughter, and had at least completely absorbed the true meaning of the Great Tao, improving their strength with every second. As for truly grasping the heaven-destroying 9 swords, the greater their grasp was over the regulation of slaughter, the stronger the might this sword technique would show, and there was no limit. Or rather, the limit was Celestial King tier, and it was a height like the 8th heaven or 9th heaven Celestial King tier. Bewitching Maiden Row was slightly inferior, but as a top-tier Emperor tier of 4th severance, once she broke through to the Dividing Soul tier, even if there was still a certain distance between her and monarch tiers like Ling Han, this distance had been endlessly shrunk. At least, it was not a completely one-sided battle, and she could manage an exchange of a few moves, at the very least. Meanwhile, the Heavenly Phoenix Divine Maiden was still making no headway. Thankfully, the lifespan of a Genesis tier was long enough, so there was completely no need for her to worry about death. They left very quietly, and when they returned, it was also very quiet. The 5 of them quietly entered Alchemy City, and practically no one knew about it. It was like they had never even left. Ling Han first went to pay his greetings to Grandmaster Ziqing, and related the rough circumstances of his trip, shocking Grandmaster Ziqing to the point of speechlessness. Goodness, this disciple was really too capable of making trouble, wasn't he? Killing a monarch tier that would have to be the heir of at least the 5th heaven or 6th heaven celestial king. Could this matter be easily resolved? In the past, Ling Han had just killed 2 heirs from the Zai clan in Thundercloud Palace, and he had already caused great trouble. Grandmaster Ziqing had expended a tremendous amount of effort, and finally managed to settle this matter. If a first heaven celestial king tier force was already so difficult to deal with, then how difficult would 5th heaven, 6th heaven, or even 8th heaven celestial king tier forces be? What was fortunate was that Ling Han had a rock palace behind him. They were not to be trifled with, either. They had a 9th heaven celestial king as protector, the strongest of the celestial realm. He had already caused the trouble, so no amount of regret could be of any help. Grandmaster Ziqing did not even bother to reprimand Ling Han, and only told him to concentrate on alchemy. If Ling Han could advance into the ranks of 5-star alchemists, then he really would be capable of becoming an equal of celestial kings. Even high-level celestial kings would have to give him some face, so killing a few heirs would naturally be considered a minor issue. Ling Han returned, and began to focus earnestly on the study of alchemy. He had reached a bottleneck in cultivation. He could not improve further unless he broke through to the dividing soul tier, but breaking through to the dividing soul tier would require him to go to a specific location. For those like himself, the Empress, and the others, if they wanted to break through to Yang Soul, they would have to go to a place called Yang Soul Ocean. There was not just one Yang Soul Ocean in the Eastern Celestial Realm, but rather a considerable number. For example, the Yang Soul Ocean closest to the calm peace heaven was shared by 7 heavens. Every time it opened, peak stage severing mundane tiers would come there to attempt breaking through to Yang Soul. There were extremely proud prodigies among them, as well as some who had failed many times, and there were also aged elders who had been struck by the immortal's tribulation to the point of being at their last breath. Undoubtedly, with the peak stage severing mundane tiers of 7 heavens gathered together, every time the Yang Soul Ocean opened, it was naturally incredibly lively. However, the number of severing mundane ancestors was still relatively few, so this number would not much exceed those that had been in the severing mundane valley. The problem was the Yang Soul Ocean would only open once every 100 million years, but Ling Han was quite lucky as he only had to wait 300 years. Otherwise, he definitely would leave the calm peace heaven to search for a Yang Soul Ocean that would be opening soon. If not, and if he'd have to wait tens of millions of years, he would not have that kind of patience. It would be a complete waste of time. But now, he could still afford a wait of 300 years. Ling Han continuously comprehended underneath the reincarnation tree, and concocted alchemical pills in the Black Tower, while his skill in alchemy improved by leaps and bounds. 97 years had already passed in real time, while 90,000 years had passed inside the Black Tower. The time of comprehension underneath the reincarnation tree was even more chillingly long, and Ling Han had finally taken that most crucial step, and become a 3-star alchemist. This was an incredibly astonishing achievement, something that would definitely make every alchemist green with envy. Ling Han was very modest, and did not even exit the Black Tower. Instead, he continued his study of spirit refinement. The skill of spirit refinement determined the heights he could reach in alchemy. Ordinarily, every 4-star alchemist would reach the 5th refinement at least, and it could be claimed that this was the lowest requirement for becoming a 4-star alchemist. Thus, Ling Han now had to first improve his skill in spirit refinement. If he advanced to the 5th refinement, he naturally would be able to push open the doors to becoming a 4-star alchemist, and could be considered a grandmaster himself. Thus, Ling Han continued to concoct alchemical pills to improve his skill in spirit refinement, regardless of the time of day or night. This kind of pill concoction would require him to expend an extraordinary amount of celestial medicine. And how rare was celestial medicine? Yet this wasn't a problem. This was all thanks to Ling Han being the future chairperson of Alchemy City, as well as having a black-hearted businessman a master who was a pro at earning money, and the astronomical wealth the latter had accumulated through who knew how many hundreds of millions of years. Whatever kind of ingredient Ling Han needed, Grandmaster Ziqing would be able to deliver it to the former at the first instant, and guarantee that Ling Han would not be incapable of concocting alchemical pills. Another 130 years later, Ling Han had gained a tremendous improvement in terms of spirit refinement, successfully advancing to 4th refinement. He was really just a step away from becoming a Grandmaster. But taking this step was extremely difficult. Just how many 3-star alchemists were there in Alchemy City? There were not many, but around 1,000 were there, and about 70% of this number was at 3rd refinement, and there was also 30% that had achieved 4th refinement. So at the very least, there were over 300 people whose skill was equal to Ling Han's. But how many of them had broken through to become 4-star alchemists? Farther, there were only Grandmaster Zi Cheng's 3 disciples, and nearer, there was only Lu Jin, and it was just these 3 that had succeeded. This showed how difficult it was, right? Though Ling Han was a super genius at alchemy, if he wanted to break through to become a 4-star alchemist, even if he had the Black Tower and Reincarnation Tree, the time he needed would be astonishingly long. He studied hard in the Black Tower, not bothering about what was going on in the outside world. Another 50-odd years had passed outside, and there was only a short 3 years left until the Yangtze Ocean opened. Ling Han was just about to set out when he suddenly received a message from Grandmaster Ziqing, asking him to pay him a visit. "I plan to concoct the 3 lives pill, and you can observe from the sidelines," Grandmaster Ziqing said. 3 lives pill, a 4-star alchemical pill, one of the 3 types of 4-star alchemical pills that was the hardest to concoct? Why was he suddenly deciding to concoct this? You're tuning into the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.